I want to be clear about something before I get into any of this. I did not enjoy being right. People think that's the thing you want. When you've spent years telling everyone something bad is coming, they think you want to be able to say, "I told you so." Stand in whatever rubble is left and point at it and say, "See, this is exactly what I said." I've been trying to figure out how to explain what it actually feels like, and the closest I've gotten is this. Imagine you spent 7 years arguing with your wife, your brother, your co-workers, your old college friends, every person whose opinion of you mattered even a little bit, telling them the bridge is structurally compromised and it's going to fail. And they laughed at you, or they nodded politely and changed the subject, or they called you obsessed, paranoid, borderline unhinged. And then one morning the bridge fails, and people you knew are in the water. That's what being right felt like. I'm recording this because Kyle thinks it's important to document the early period, and Kyle is usually right about things even when they're inconvenient. So here I am. My name is Owen Hartwell. I'm 43 years old. I was a structural engineer for 15 years before I stopped being that. And about 8 months ago, I sealed 70 feet of reinforced concrete between myself and the end of the world. This is how that happened. Let me back up to where it actually started, because the silo didn't come first. The silo was almost the last piece. What came first was a paper. Not a famous paper. Not something published in a journal with a high impact factor or cited by people with important credentials. It was a preprint, uploaded to a research archive by a virologist in the Netherlands, who, as far as I can tell, was ignored by every major institution that should have been paying attention. I found it by accident in 2016, while I was reading about something completely unrelated. I was looking into underground structure reinforcement methods for a commercial project I was consulting on. Ended up down some rabbit hole about subsurface contamination risks, and the algorithm on whatever browser I was using decided I probably also wanted to read about pathogen containment failures. Which, honestly, fair enough. The paper was titled something long and technical that I won't reproduce here, because it doesn't matter. What mattered was the core of it. The virologist, her name was Anke Vosberg, and I looked her up later, and she was real. She had a real institutional affiliation. She had published real work before this, had been tracking mutation rates in a specific family of RNA viruses. Not rabies, not anything you'd recognize. Something that mostly lived in bat populations in a region of Southeast Asia. What she'd found was a mutation pathway that, under the right conditions of population density and temperature variation, could produce something with a transmission rate high enough to be genuinely catastrophic and a neurological effect profile that was, her words, unprecedented in the existing literature. She wasn't predicting zombies. I want to be precise about that. She wasn't saying the word zombie anywhere in that document. What she was describing, in careful clinical language, was a neurological progression that would cause severe behavioral disinhibition, loss of higher cognitive function, extreme aggression, and an almost complete severing of self-preservation instinct. The virus, in its mutated form, would essentially strip a person down to something operating purely on impulse and sensation. No planning, no recognition of faces or context, just movement toward stimulus. I read it 3 times that night. My wife, Liz, asked me around 11 o'clock why I was still at the kitchen table, and I said I was reading something for work, which was a lie I had already trained myself to tell by that point in the marriage. We were already getting toward the end of things by then, though neither of us was saying it clearly yet. I didn't panic after reading that paper. That's an important thing to understand about how I work. I don't panic. I was trained, by 15 years of looking at buildings and infrastructure and load calculations, to assess information and respond to what the information actually says, not to what your gut is insisting it says. What the information said was, there exists a viable pathway to a catastrophic neurological pandemic. The world's pandemic preparedness infrastructure is not designed to respond to something with this behavioral profile, and the societal failure mode, meaning how civilization actually fails if something like this happens, would be fast and total. So I started planning. Not dramatically, not all at once. I pulled up a spreadsheet. That's how it started. An Excel spreadsheet. at 11:30 at night, at the kitchen table, with the sound of Liz's television coming through the bedroom door. I started listing what would be needed: food stores, water, medical supplies, power, a location that could be sealed, defended, and made self-sustaining, communications equipment, tools, people with the right skills. I worked on that spreadsheet for 4 hours. When I finally went to bed, I knew 3 things. This was real, this was possible, and I was going to need a lot of money. I need to explain the money part because everyone always gets hung up on the $1 million. At the time I started looking at properties, I had about $300,000 in liquid savings. I'd been a structural engineer for a decade and a half. I'd made decent money. I'd also been careful with it. I'd never bought a flashy car. We'd rented for the first 6 years of our marriage before buying a modest house in a mid-sized city in Kansas. I didn't have expensive hobbies. The money was just sitting in index funds, because that's what you're supposed to do with money, and I'd done what I was supposed to do. I also had about $400,000 in equity in the house, and a defined benefit pension that I could borrow against. The numbers weren't comfortable, but they were possible. I started researching decommissioned military properties in early 2017. There are more of them than most people realize. The Cold War built an enormous amount of infrastructure across the American Midwest and Great Plains. Missile silos, command centers, radar stations, underground bunkers. And when that era ended, a lot of that infrastructure was decommissioned, sometimes sold, sometimes just closed up and left. The government doesn't typically advertise these sales. You have to know where to look. I knew where to look because of my engineering background. I'd done work adjacent to some defense infrastructure projects early in my career, and I had contacts who knew people who knew which properties occasionally came available. One of those contacts, a guy I'd worked with named Dale, who'd since moved into real estate, sent me an email in March of 2017 that said, "There's a decommissioned Atlas missile facility in western Kansas that's coming up for sale. The land parcel is about 12 acres. The silo itself is 82 feet deep, 9 feet in diameter, and that's just the main shaft. There are lateral tunnels, equipment rooms, a launch control center with livable space. Previous private owner tried to turn it into a data center, ran out of money, walked away. Asking price is $1.2 million. I drove out to look at it the following weekend, without telling Liz where I was going. That was the beginning of the end of my marriage, and also the beginning of the rest of my life. Both things happened at the same time, and I'm still not sure how to feel about that. The property was in the middle of nowhere, which is exactly what it needed to be. You turned off a state highway onto a county road, drove about 4 miles through flat farmland that belonged to a neighboring operation, and came to a chain-link fence around 12 acres of grass and scrub brush. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A slight rise in the ground where the main silo cap was. A few old concrete aprons that used to serve as equipment pads. An access road that needed work. Nothing that would tell you what was underneath. I walked the surface for about an hour, checking the fence line, looking at the ground, listening to nothing but wind. Then I used the entry code Dale had given me, went down the access ladder, and stood at the bottom of a shaft that smelled like old rust and recycled air, and I understood immediately that this was the right place. It needed a lot of work. The previous owner had done some of it, run commercial electrical in, installed an HVAC stub, put in some basic shelving in the lateral rooms, but had stopped when the data center money ran out. The generators were old but functional. The water cisterns had been cleaned but not filled. The blast doors, which were the most important single feature, were in excellent shape. Those doors were built in the 1960s to withstand the pressure wave from a nuclear detonation within 3 miles. Nothing short of a sustained military assault with heavy equipment was getting through them. I stood there for a long time in that quiet, 70 feet down. Concrete walls 2 feet thick. The blast door at the bottom of the access shaft was like nothing I'd ever touched. 3 feet of solid steel, counterweighted so it moved relatively smoothly, but built to a tolerances that made my engineering brain go quiet in appreciation. I put both hands on it and felt the cold of it through my palms. This was going to work. I bought it in August of 2017 for just under $1 million, after negotiating down from the asking price by pointing out several legitimate infrastructure issues that needed repair. I used the liquid savings, borrowed against the pension, and took out a second mortgage on the house that Liz and I owned together. She found out about the second mortgage about 3 weeks after I took it out. That conversation was not good. I'm not going to reconstruct it in detail because it's not relevant to this record and because some things should stay private, even when everything else is being documented. What I'll say is that Liz was not wrong about anything she said. She was right that I hadn't told her. She was right that it was our house and our money. She was right that this was not behavior she signed up for. She was not right that I was crazy, but I understood why she thought so, and I couldn't prove she was wrong in any way that was going to matter to her in that moment. We separated in November of 2017. The divorce was final in June of 2018. She got the house, which was fair, and I moved into an apartment and started spending every available weekend driving out to the silo property. The work I did out there over the next 4 years was the most sustained, focused effort of my life. I'm saying that as someone who used to pull all-nighters on structural drawings for skyscrapers. Nothing compared to the silo. The first thing was power. The existing generators were diesel, which was not wrong, but I wanted redundancy. I installed a ground-mounted solar array on the surface, small enough to look like an agricultural operation, which was how I permitted it, connected to a battery bank underground. The diesel generators stayed as backup. I ran the electrical throughout the tunnel system, put in LED lighting, installed a ventilation filtration system that could operate in sealed mode and clean outside air before it came in. That filtration system cost me $48,000, and I didn't think twice about it, because the whole point was to be able to survive something airborne. Water came next. The existing cisterns held about 10,000 gallons. I added a secondary system with UV filtration and a hand pump backup, connected to a deep well I had drilled at the surface. The well was legal. I told the drilling company I was developing the property for agricultural use. They didn't ask further questions. Food storage was the most time-consuming part. I spent about 18 months building up the stores, buying in quantities that wouldn't attract attention, rotating through to maintain freshness, learning which packaging methods held up in a cool, dry underground environment. At peak, I had about 24 months of calories for 6 people, stored in the lateral equipment rooms. Freeze-dried staples, canned goods, grains in sealed plastic drums, oil, salt, sugar, dried beans and lentils, coffee, because I knew that would matter more than people thought, medical supplies, seeds for a growing operation if we ever got that far. The growing operation was an idea I had in 2019 after meeting Carla Bostwick. Carla was an agronomist. She worked for a university extension office in the region, helping farmers optimize their soil and crop planning. I met her at a farm supply store about 30 miles from the silo when she was asking the clerk detailed questions about mycorrhizal inoculants, and I couldn't help but join the conversation. She was 40 at the time, recently divorced herself, matter of fact in a way that I appreciated immediately. We had coffee at a diner nearby and talked for 2 hours. And somewhere in that conversation I said something that implied I was interested in indoor growing systems, and she tilted her head a little and said that's an odd thing for a structural engineer to be working on. I didn't tell her everything that first meeting, or the second. By the third meeting, over dinner, I'd told her most of it, and she'd sat quietly through the whole thing without interrupting. When I was done, she looked at her coffee cup for a long time and said, "Is this something you actually believe is coming? Or something you're doing as a kind of extended anxiety response to general catastrophe thinking?" I said I thought it was both, but that the distinction didn't really matter because the outcome was the same either way. She said, "I'm in." Just like that. I'm in. She'd been following some of the same literature I had her own concerns about food system vulnerabilities, and had been wondering for years how to think about resilience at a scale that actually mattered. The silo gave her a framework. I gave her a growing room, 60 square feet of hydroponic and soil-based planting space in one of the lateral rooms, LED grow lights on a timer, seed stock she chose herself. Within 8 months, she'd produced the first actual food from that space, a crop of sweet potatoes and leafy greens, and a few trays of herbs that made the tunnel smell, just briefly, like something living. I tell people Carla saved us. I mean that more literally than most people realize. The team came together slowly, one person at a time, over about 2 years. I was not running some kind of prepper recruitment operation. I wasn't posting on forums or going to conventions. Every person I brought in was someone I had a specific, considered reason to trust. And every conversation about the silo was a conversation I'd thought about for a long time before having it. Derek Pruitt was my second recruit after Carla. Derek was a mechanical engineer, focused on diesel systems and electrical infrastructure, and he had the additionally useful quality of being someone who didn't believe what he didn't see evidence for, and didn't spend a lot of time being alarmed once he did see evidence. We'd worked together on a manufacturing plant retrofit 12 years before. He was the kind of guy who showed up with his own tools and left a project better than he found it. When I walked him through the silo on a Friday afternoon and showed him what I'd built, his first comment was that the secondary ventilation runs were undersized for the volume, and he'd fix that over the weekend if I had the materials. He did. They've never failed since. Nate Fielding was third. He was a former Army combat medic who'd been out for 6 years and was working as an ER nurse in a town about 50 miles from the silo property. I met him through a mutual contact who knew we'd both be interested in wilderness medicine. Nate was the quietest person I've ever spent extended time with. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that meant he was always processing and very rarely speaking without a reason. When I told him what I was building, he asked 3 questions. What's the medical supply situation? What's the trauma capability? And, do I have to agree with your assessment of why we need this place to participate? I said the first 2 were addressed and improving, and no. He drove out the following Saturday and didn't leave until Sunday night. He reorganized the medical bay by himself. I let him. Tom Gilmore came in 2020, recommended by a contact of Derek's. Tom was 61, recently retired, and had spent most of his working life in telecommunications, not cellular, old-school landline and radio infrastructure. Ham radio operator since he was 17. He understood communications in a way that the rest of us didn't, and communications was the gap I knew I had. Tom brought his wife Donna into the conversations early on, and Donna came out to the silo exactly twice. She thought the whole thing was, she used the word elaborate, which was diplomatic. She didn't believe the same things Tom and I believed. But she and Tom had been married for 36 years, and she wasn't going to tell him what to do with his time. That becomes important later. I'm going to have to come back to that. Kyle Sanderson was last, and youngest, and honestly the most essential person we had for what the situation actually turned out to be. Kyle was 26 when he joined in 2021. He did security systems for commercial clients, cameras, access control, monitoring. But his real interest was drones and sensor networks. He'd built his own surveillance drone fleet for an agricultural client, and when he heard what I was putting together, through a contact in the regional prepper community, who I'd spoken to, without revealing the silo, he reached out directly. His email was 3 sentences long. He said he had skills I probably needed, he was willing to sign an NDA, and he wanted to see the project before committing. I invited him. He walked in and spent 4 hours in the tunnel with no expression on his face, and then he looked at me and said, "Your blind spots are the surface and the perimeter, and I can fix both." He built us eyes. Over the following year, Kyle designed and installed a camera network that covered the full perimeter of the property, the access road, the surrounding fields out to about half a mile, and the sky. He set up a drone station in what we started calling the operations room, a repurposed equipment bay that became our nerve center. He wrote his own monitoring software that processed the feeds and flagged anomalies. When the time came, and everything was happening at once, and everything outside was chaos, we could see it. Being able to see was the thing that kept us from making the worst mistakes in the early days. I should talk about what we thought was coming versus what actually came, because they weren't exactly the same thing. I had spent 4 years thinking about the specific scenario from Anke Vosberg's paper, an airborne respiratory pathogen with neurological effects. That's what I'd designed against. The blast door filtration system, the sealed ventilation, the air quality monitoring equipment. I was thinking about a fog of contagion that we needed to stay out of, something you breathed in. What actually happened was different enough to matter in some specific ways, and similar enough in its broad strokes to vindicate the preparation entirely. The outbreak, as far as we've been able to piece together from broadcasts, radio intercepts, and what survivors have told us, started in about 4 places simultaneously. One in Southeast Asia, one in Eastern Europe, one in Brazil, and one in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Whether those were 4 independent emergence events or whether someone or something was moving samples between them is a question I genuinely don't know the answer to, and I'm not going to speculate about it here. What matters for this record is the effect, not the origin. The effect was neurological, exactly as Vosberg had described. The infected were not dead. That's something I need to be specific about, because the word everyone reaches for is zombie, and what they picture is a Hollywood thing. Rotting, slow, staggering toward you. The infected were alive. Their hearts were beating. Their lungs were working. Their muscles were functional. What was gone was everything above the brainstem, or nearly everything. They moved. They reacted to sound. They reacted to movement in their peripheral vision. They bit. That was how transmission happened. Through saliva, through blood contact. And they didn't stop moving until they were physically unable to continue. Gunshot wounds that would drop a normal person didn't necessarily stop them if the shot didn't sever the motor chain. They felt nothing. They didn't stop for pain. They also, critically, did not think. They had no strategy. They did not open doors. They did not climb. They moved toward sound, and they stopped when there was no sound. In open fields, a group of them would mill in loose circles, occasionally bumping into each other, reacting to any loud noise by surging toward it. They were not communicating. They were not coordinating, but they moved in the same direction at the same time, because they were all reacting to the same stimulus, and that created a kind of pseudo-swarm behavior that felt organized but wasn't. Understanding that distinction saved our lives, multiple times. The transmission vector was the bite, not airborne, which meant my filtration system was useful, but for different reasons than I'd planned. It meant we could go outside, under certain conditions, without being infected by the air itself. What we couldn't do was get bitten. Getting bitten led to symptoms within 2 to 8 hours, full transition within 24, and then you were one of them. I'm going to come back to that timeline number, because we saw what it looked like from the inside, once, and it's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. The day it started, for us, was a Tuesday in October. I know exactly where I was. I was in the parking lot of a hardware store about 40 miles from the silo property, loading bags of concrete mix into the back of my truck. I was back at work part-time by then, consulting, mostly remote, and trying to balance that with the ongoing project. Carla had asked for additional soil for the growing room. Normal Tuesday. My phone started doing something unusual, around 10 a.m. The news alerts were coming in too fast, one after another, stacking up before I could clear them. That's unusual enough on its own that I stopped and looked. The first few were about incidents in Seattle and Portland. Violent incidents, mass casualty, cause unclear. The language was careful and vague, the way news language gets when reporters are seeing something they don't have a framework for yet. Then there were alerts about flight groundings, about a bridge closure in Eugene, about a hospital in emergency lockdown. I stood in that parking lot for about 90 seconds, reading. Then I put my phone in my pocket, loaded the last 2 bags of concrete, got in my truck, and called Derek. He picked up immediately. I said, "It's starting." He said, "I know, I'm already on my way." That's the thing about having the right team. You don't have to explain things to them. You've already done the explaining. You've spent years making sure everyone knows what the signal looks like, and what to do when they see it. I called Carla, then Nate, then Tom, then Kyle. Every call was short. Every one of them was already moving, or already at the silo. Tom was the only one I had to explain what was happening to, because he'd been in his workshop without his phone that morning. But once I gave him 30 seconds of information, he said give me 2 hours and hung up. The drive to the silo took me about an hour. The radio in the truck was telling me the same story it was telling everyone. Strange attacks. Cities in the early stages of panic. Some government statements that were carefully measured to avoid saying the thing everyone was starting to understand. I passed 2 accidents on the county roads. Both of them looked recent. Both of them abandoned. I passed a small town where people were standing in their front yards looking at their phones. I did not stop. I pulled through the gate at 11:47 a.m. I know because I noted it in the logbook, which was a habit I'd had since the beginning. The entry log was part of the security protocol. Kyle's truck was already there. So was Carla's. Nate arrived about 20 minutes after me. Derek was last, pulling in at 2:15 p.m., with a trailer loaded with extra diesel, and a look on his face like a man who had just driven through something he didn't want to describe yet. We sealed the blast door at 3 p.m. There were 5 of us in there. I want to be clear that there were supposed to be 6, and 1 person was not there, and Tom Gilmore's wife Donna was not at the silo because she had not believed this day was coming, and she was home 40 miles away when everything started going wrong. Tom sealed the door with the rest of us. I watched him do it. He put both hands on the wheel that locks the mechanism, turned it 3 full rotations, and the door settled into its frame with a sound like the planet shifting on its axis. Then he stepped back and stood there with his hands at his sides and didn't say anything for a long time. Nobody said anything to him. There's nothing to say to someone in that moment. I just made sure he knew where the radio equipment was, and I left him to set it up, because having something to do is the thing that keeps a person functional when they're trying not to think about something. The first 3 days underground were the closest thing to controlled chaos I've ever experienced. You have to understand that even though we'd planned this, even though we'd spent years building and stocking and preparing, there's a difference between the plan and the thing. The plan exists in a spreadsheet. The thing exists in a 9-foot concrete shaft with recycled air, and 5 people who've been operating individually and now have to function as something else. The first friction was small and stupid, which is always how it goes. Derek and Nate had different ideas about where to stack the extra medical supplies. It was a 2-minute argument, but it was sharp-edged, in a way that told me everyone's nerves were at the surface. I didn't intervene in that specific argument. I let Nate win it, because he was right about the ergonomics of the space. And afterward, I pulled Derek aside and said, "The issue isn't the supplies, and we both know it." Derek said yeah, and that was the end of that conversation. The operations room was where Kyle spent most of those first 3 days, setting up his monitoring software, calibrating the cameras, launching his drones in short reconnaissance sorties to map what was happening on the surface and in the nearest areas. He had 3 drones, all of them small, DJI-class quadcopters, modified with extended battery packs and better cameras than stock. He'd also built 2 fixed-wing units that could stay up longer but covered a narrower field. What the drones showed us, starting on day 2, was bad, and then it got worse. The county road that ran past our property was empty of moving vehicles by day 2. There were cars stopped on it. A few pulled to the shoulder, a few just sitting in the lane as if the driver had simply stopped. One of them had its door open. We saw movement in the fields about a quarter mile away. Slow, milling movement that wasn't animal. Kyle's software counted 11 of them in a loose cluster, near what looked like an abandoned piece of farm equipment. They weren't doing anything, just moving in small circles, occasionally stopping, occasionally bumping against each other. When a large bird flew overhead and made noise, they all turned toward the sound at the same time. I watched that camera feed for about 20 minutes without saying anything. Then I turned to Kyle and asked him how far the nearest town was from the property. He said, "About 7 miles." I said, "Can you get eyes on it?" He spent 40 minutes reconfiguring one of the fixed-wing units and launched it from the surface access hatch in a quick up-down-back maneuver that he'd practiced for exactly this kind of situation. The footage when it came back was high altitude, grainy, but the shape of what was happening in town was clear enough. I won't describe what we saw in specific detail because it doesn't serve any purpose here. What I'll say is that the town of about 3,000 people was already, by day 2, something that could not be returned to the way it was. There were fires in 2 locations. There was movement in the streets that had a specific character to it, the milling and reacting that we'd already learned to recognize. There were also, here and there, people moving differently, running, hiding, moving with purpose. Not many, but some. Carla was standing behind me when Kyle brought the drone back. She put her hand on my shoulder briefly, and then went to check on the grow room. I sat down in the operations chair and started making a list. Week 1 underground was about establishing the routines that would keep us functional. You can't run on emergency adrenaline for more than a few days before you start breaking down. I'd read enough about long-duration isolation and high-stress environments, submarine service, Antarctic expeditions, space station operations, to know that routine was the thing. Not rigid, not military, but consistent. The same general shape to each day, the same meal times, the same sleep schedule, the same distribution of tasks. It sounds almost boring when I describe it. That was the point. We did a meal at 07:30, a planning session at 0900, work periods through the afternoon with a check-in at 1600, dinner at 18:30, and a communications session with Tom at 2100, when he would sweep frequencies and document anything he picked up. Sleep was encouraged from 2300 onward, though the quality of it varied a lot person to person. Tom picked up his first signal on day 4. It was an emergency broadcast from FEMA or something, using FEMA's transmission system, cycling on a standard emergency frequency, saying the things those broadcasts always say. Stay home. Do not travel. Authorities are responding. This is an emergency message. It was automated. Tom could tell it was automated because of the gap between cycles and the way certain words were clipped. There was no human on the other end. He sat in his chair with his headphones on and listened to that recording cycle through 6 times before he noted it in his log and took off the headphones. On day 6, we had our first genuine emergency. Derek was checking the generator systems when he noticed that the secondary fuel line from the storage tank was showing a pressure drop. Not catastrophic, not yet. But a pressure drop in a fuel line has exactly one explanation, which is a leak somewhere. And a leak somewhere in a sealed underground environment filled with diesel fuel and electricity is not something you want to wait on. He and I spent 4 hours tracing the line. It was a physical search, hands and eyes, because we didn't have a gas detector sensitive enough to pinpoint it. We found the leak at a junction in the equipment room closest to the tunnel's eastern lateral, a fitting that had been installed with a slightly misaligned thread and had worked itself loose over time, probably vibration from the surface generators. A small leak. The diesel had been dripping onto concrete, not pooling anywhere dangerous, but left unaddressed, it would have been a fire risk within a week. Derek fixed it in 40 minutes. Standard pipe fitting repair, nothing exotic. But the 2 hours we spent searching for it, crawling through tight tunnel sections with flashlights, breathing the smell of diesel and old concrete and recycled air, that was when I felt for the first time what it was actually going to mean to live in this place for an unknown amount of time. The ceiling of that tunnel section was about 5.5 feet, which meant I was bent at the neck for the entire search. My knees ached from the concrete floor. The flashlight kept catching dust particles and turning them into false movement. And every 10 minutes or so, through whatever acoustic channel existed between the tunnel walls and the surface above, I could hear something. Faint, irregular, a sound like dragging or shuffling, very distant and distorted by 60 feet of earth and rock. I asked Derek if he heard it. He stopped what he was doing and tilted his head, listened for about 30 seconds. Yeah, he said. We didn't discuss it further. We fixed the fitting and went back to the operations room. I need to talk about what happened on day 11. This is the part I told myself I'd be clinical about when I wrote it down. The part that I think matters most for anyone reading this as a record of what we went through. I'm going to try to write it the way I'd write an incident report. Not because I don't feel anything about it, because I feel too much. And the clinical version is the one I can actually get through. Tom had been using the radio equipment to try to make contact with anyone in range. Not just receiving, transmitting. On the ham frequencies he knew, using a low-power mode to minimize the chance of attracting anything to the surface antenna. He'd been doing this every night during the 2100 communications session, and he'd been getting nothing back. Static. The automated FEMA loop, still going. Occasional fragments of what might have been voices, too degraded to be sure. On day 10, he got something. It was a woman's voice on a frequency he'd been monitoring without transmitting on, because something about the signal characteristics suggested it was a stronger transmitter. She was giving what sounded like a repeating status message: location, group size, supply situation, request for contact. She identified herself as being in a town about 22 miles from our location. She said there were 9 survivors in a school building. She said they were running low on insulin. She had a diabetic in the group, and they needed contact. Tom transcribed it, brought it to me. I read it 3 times, looked at Kyle's current surface map, looked at the last drone footage from that general direction, which was 4 days old. I sat with that information for a long time. Day 11, Tom got something different. Same frequency, different voice. Male, older, and not giving a status message, just saying a name. Donna, repeating it. Donna, this is Tom. Please come back on if you can hear this. Donna. I wasn't in the communications room when it happened. Kyle came to get me, and by the time I got there, Tom had been transmitting his wife's name for about 20 minutes. His headset was half on, half hanging off his ear. His handwriting on the log pad had gotten shakier with each line. I sat down next to him. The transmission was still going out. I didn't stop him. I just sat there. He kept going for another hour. There was no response. At some point after midnight, he stopped transmitting. Very carefully took off the headset, put it down on the table and said, "She would have answered by now." I said, "I know." He said, "She didn't know to leave." I said, "I know, I'm sorry, Tom." He didn't say anything after that. He sat there in the dark of the communications room for a long time, and I stayed with him. At about 2 a.m., he asked me if I thought there was any chance she'd found a safe location somewhere. I told him the honest answer, which was that I didn't know, and there were people surviving out there, and I wasn't willing to say it was impossible. He nodded. He went to his bunk. In the morning, he came to breakfast at the usual time. He ate. He asked Kyle for the latest surface camera footage. He went back to the radio room and started his morning sweep. That was Tom Gilmore, 61 years old, 36 years of marriage, and the most disciplined grief I've ever watched a person carry. The woman on the radio was named Janet Burrows. I'm coming back to her because she becomes important later. But in the context of day 11, what she represented was the first concrete decision I had to make about people outside. We could hear her. We had her location, approximately, and we had no way to help her in that moment. Going outside on day 11, with the situation as uncertain as it was, with no information about road conditions or infected density between our property and her location, with 5 people in the silo who needed everyone present to function, it wasn't the right call. I knew that. I made the decision to respond to her, let her know we existed, gather information, and wait. I told Tom to transmit back on her frequency, which he did. She came back within minutes, which told me she was monitoring constantly and probably desperate. We established contact. We got her full situation. 9 survivors, elementary school building, 2-story brick construction with chain link fencing around the playground perimeter, 1 diabetic, 1 broken arm, 1 elderly woman who was stable but struggling, food for about 2 weeks, water from the school's tanks, not sure how long. I asked her about conditions between her location and ours. She'd been watching from the 2nd floor windows and had a reasonably good picture of her immediate area. She said the main road through town had maybe 30 to 40 infected, spread out, mostly static but reactive to sound. The fields between the school and our direction were hard to see at night. I told her we'd make contact again every evening and that we were working on options. Kyle and I spent 4 hours that night looking at maps and drone footage, planning a potential route from our property to her location. The most direct route was the county road, which was flat and open, and required passing through the edge of the nearest small town, which we already knew from drone footage was densely populated with infected. The long route went around, through fields and farm tracks, added about 8 miles, but avoided the population center. We didn't go on day 11 or day 12. Day 14, 2 things changed. The drone footage showed the infected in the fields between us and her location were thinning, Whatever had drawn them toward the town center was still drawing them, and the outlying areas were getting clearer. And Janet Burrows reported that the diabetic in her group, a man in his 60s whose name she gave as Bill, was down to his last insulin vial. That changed the calculation. The first surface mission was nothing like I'd imagined it would be, and I'd imagined it many times. Derek and I went. That was the team. 2 people, minimum footprint, armed. We'd had firearms in the silo from the beginning. 2 AR pattern rifles, a shotgun, 3 handguns, enough ammunition to last for meaningful engagements, but not to fight a sustained war. We treated them as last resort tools, not primary survival equipment, because the primary strategy was to not need them. The thing about the infected that Kyle's drone work had taught us was that they were almost entirely sound reactive. In the daytime, with ambient noise, you could get fairly close to a stationary one before it oriented toward you. At night, in dead silence, a snapped twig at 100 yards would turn every head in the area. Sound discipline was the skill. Moving carefully, avoiding metal-on-metal contact, not talking, reading the environment. That was the difference between a mission that worked and one that didn't. We went at first light. I drove a farm truck that I'd left on the surface before we sealed. Old, diesel, and quiet if you kept it under 30. We took the long route, through the fields, which meant driving across someone's unplanted winter fields with a compass and a paper map, because electronics have batteries that die and screens that reflect light. 12 miles each way, approximately, the long way around. I want to describe what the surface felt like after 14 days underground. The cold hit first. It was mid-October, western Kansas, and the morning temperature was in the mid-30s. I'd been living in the climate-controlled tunnel air, which we kept at about 65. Stepping out of the surface access hatch, the cold went through my jacket and into my chest, in a way that felt almost physical, like being grabbed. I stood outside for 30 seconds, just breathing. The air tasted completely different from tunnel air, sharper, grassier, with something underneath it that I didn't immediately identify, but that my brain responded to with a kind of sick recognition. The smell of something biological decaying in the cold. Not overwhelming, distant, but present. Derek came up behind me. He breathed in once, slowly, through his nose. "Yeah," he said. We got in the truck. The drive through the fields was slow. We kept headlights off. In the flat Kansas landscape, with nothing taller than corn stubble in every direction, there was enough pre-dawn light to navigate by. We hit the farm track that Kyle had identified as the best route and followed it east-northeast, engine murmuring, windows cracked so we could hear outside. I saw the first infected about 3 miles from the silo. It was alone, standing in the middle of the farm track, not moving, just standing there, with its head tilted slightly, the way they do when there's no stimulus, but the motor system is still running. It was wearing what had been a flannel shirt and jeans, and 1 boot. Its head turned when it heard the truck at about 200 yards. I slowed and stopped, watched. It started moving toward us. Slow walk, arms loose. No expression, because the face wasn't making expressions anymore. It wasn't running. It wasn't speeding up, just walking toward the sound of the engine at maybe 3 miles an hour. I let it walk toward us for about 40 seconds, watching the technique work in real time. It had no idea where exactly we were, just the general direction. When it got to about 100 feet, I eased the truck into reverse and backed up slowly until it stopped tracking us and went back to its milling circle. Then I went around it, wide through the field, and kept going. We found 16 more on the route. Each time we found one, or a cluster, we stopped, waited, planned around them. The clusters of 3 or more were trickier, because moving one cluster toward another by accident could merge them and create something harder to deal with. We were careful. We treated every infected like it was a problem to route around, not a threat to engage, because engagement makes noise, and noise was the worst thing. We found the school at about 7 a.m. The chain link around the playground was intact. I could see figures at the second-floor windows as we came down the road. They'd been watching. One of the windows opened, and a woman leaned out and said, very quietly, "Are you Owen?" I said yes. She said give us 2 minutes. She was Janet Burrows, 48 years old, middle school music teacher, and the most organized person I have ever seen in a chaotic situation. She'd maintained a full written log of the 9 survivors since day 1. Names, ages, health status, medical needs, skills, psychological state. She handed me the log when we came inside, like she was handing over a project file. I didn't know whether to be impressed or heartbroken. I was both. We'd brought insulin, a full supply from our medical stores, more than Bill needed immediately, because Nate had had the foresight to stockpile broadly across common chronic disease needs. We also brought food, not our stores, which we weren't drawing down, but supplies from the truck cab that Derek had collected from the hardware store's break room during his drive to the silo on day 1. He'd grabbed everything edible he could reach, which turned out to be 3 cases of protein bars and a box of instant oatmeal packets and 2 big cans of coffee. When I put the coffee on the table in the school's break room, a woman named Beverly, who was 72 and had barely spoken since the outbreak, looked at it for a moment and then put her face in her hands and cried. Derek looked at me. I looked at Derek. We drank coffee with those 9 people for an hour, and then we had a hard conversation about what came next. The school was not a long-term solution, and Janet knew it. The fencing around the playground was 4 feet of chain link, which meant a determined cluster of infected could push it over. The second floor was defensible. The first floor doors were barricaded, but the barricades were furniture, and furniture has limits. They had water for maybe 10 more days. Food, with what we'd brought, for 3 weeks. After that, without resupply or relocation, the math started getting ugly. I offered them the silo. Not immediately. I said, there's a location 12 miles from here that is much more secure, and we want to discuss the possibility of moving some or all of your group there. This is not a command. It's an offer. We need to be honest with each other about what it means. Janet asked what it meant. I said, our space has limits. We have supplies for about 6 people for 2 years. 9 more people changes those numbers. We'll make it work, but everyone needs to understand that going in. She looked around the room at her group, 8 faces looking back at her. 1 person, Bill, sitting apart with a blanket around him, looking at the floor. She said, what are the conditions? I said, everyone contributes. Everyone follows safety protocols, the infected protocols, the entry procedures, the rationing rules. Everyone gets a job. There are no passengers. She said, 1 condition from us, we stay together. All 9 of us or none of us. I said, deal. It took 3 trips to move 9 people, 12 miles in the farm truck. Derek drove every run while I stayed at the school to maintain order and assist anyone who needed physical help during the loading. The infected in the area had drifted during the morning, and the route was cleaner than our incoming run had been. But the second trip back we had a close call near an old grain elevator, where about 20 infected had clustered around the base of the structure, reacting to some sound from inside. Something alive in there, a raccoon or a bird. And when Derek came around the corner of the road, the nearest cluster heard the engine and turned. He stopped, killed the engine, sat still for 2 minutes while they moved toward where the sound had been, and then milled uncertainly at the road edge. Then he eased the truck through a gap, very slow, very quiet. He said later that he could have reached out the window and touched the nearest one as he passed. He brought the last group home at 2 p.m. 12 people total now in the silo. It was loud for an hour, not in a bad way. Just the sound of more people in a space that had been quiet, more voices, more movement. Kyle had spent the morning rearranging the lateral storage rooms to create additional sleeping space. Carla had cooked a big pot of rice and canned beans, and it was ready when the last group came down the ladder. We all ate together at 6 p.m. 14 people around the table we'd built in the central tunnel section. It was the first time I'd heard laughter underground. The weeks that followed were the most sustained organizational challenge of my life, and I built skyscrapers. 14 people in a tunnel system is manageable if, and only if, the logistics are solid and everyone buys into the system. Some of Janet's group had obvious skills and slotted in quickly. Her, because she was a natural organizer. Bill, who turned out to be a retired pharmacist and suddenly had more value in our medical operation than we'd expected. A young woman named Holly, who had been partway through nursing school and knew more than she gave herself credit for. The others found their places more slowly, but they all found them. 2 of Janet's people were a problem. Not dangerous, not malicious, just psychologically fragile in ways that the underground environment made worse. A man in his 30s named Greg, who'd been a high school baseball coach, was comfortable in the tunnel for about 4 days, and then started having extended panic episodes at unpredictable times. Not violent, but disruptive, hyperventilating, needing to be talked down, occasionally causing the kind of noise that made everyone's nerves go tight. And a woman named Pam, early 60s, retired bank employee, who within a week had decided that certain rules I'd established were unreasonable and had appointed herself the voice of dissent about them. The rule she objected to most was the rationing protocol. I had calculated, with Carla's help, what a sustainable daily caloric intake looked like for a group of 14, with our current stores, plus what Carla could grow. The number was not comfortable. It was around 1,800 calories per day per person, which is below what most adults in a sedentary modern life are used to, but which is workable, especially with the high-quality foods we'd stored. Nobody was going to get scurvy. Nobody was going to waste away, but it meant that second helpings weren't a thing, and that certain preferred foods were rationed further, and that some flexibility that people expected was gone. Pam felt that 1,800 calories was essentially starvation, and that I was not qualified to make health decisions for other adults. She said this at dinner one evening, to the table. It stopped all other conversation. I said, "You're right that you're an adult and I don't control you. You're right that the caloric target is lower than you're used to. You're wrong that it's starvation. It's a well-documented maintenance level for a person doing moderate activity in a temperature-controlled environment. I'll make the data available to anyone who wants to see it. If you'd like to propose a revised plan that accounts for how we'd replace any additional food we consume without surface missions that carry risk, I'll listen to it." She didn't have a revised plan. The conversation ended. She kept being difficult for another 2 weeks. Then something happened that changed her. Nate was treating a minor wound on one of Janet's group, a boy of 14 named Ryan, who'd cut his hand on a shelf bracket. Nothing serious. Nate had it cleaned and bandaged in 5 minutes. But the boy winced when Nate pressed on the cut, and Nate noticed and said, "Does that hurt more than you'd expect?" The boy said, "I don't know. Maybe." Nate looked at it again. He said, "Owen, can you come here?" I came and looked at what Nate was showing me. The skin around the bandaged cut was slightly discolored, and not in the way a normal bruise develops. It had a specific pattern. Nate looked at me very carefully, and I looked back at him. The boy said, "What is it?" Nate said, "When did you cut this?" The boy said, 4 days ago, at the school. I didn't tell anyone because it wasn't that bad." Nate said, "How did you cut it? Did something bite you?" The boy went very still. He said, "No, it was a shelf bracket." Nate said, "Are you sure?" Long silence. The boy said, "There was a lot going on when we were leaving. I don't know. I don't think so." Nate and I left the room. We went to the far end of the communications tunnel where nobody could hear us. Nate said, "It could be an infection from the cut. It could be secondary contamination. I don't know." I said, "What are the options?" He said, "Isolate him, monitor him. If it's what I think it might be, we'll know within about 12 hours. If I'm wrong, we've scared a kid for nothing." I said, "Do it." We put Ryan in the supply room at the far end of the eastern lateral. I explained to his mother, as calmly as I could, that it was a precaution and that Nate would monitor him closely. His mother, a woman named Gail, looked at me with the specific face of a person who understands exactly what is being said and hasn't decided yet whether to let themselves feel it. Pam, who had been standing nearby, heard enough to understand the situation. She came to me afterward and said, "Is he going to turn?" I said, "I don't know. We're watching." She said, "And if he does?" I said, "We handle it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she went back to the room she shared with 3 other people and didn't make another complaint about the rationing protocol for the rest of our time underground. Ryan was fine. I'm putting that down clearly because I didn't know he was going to be fine when I was in the middle of it, and I want to be accurate about what that 20 hours felt like. The discoloration around the cut did not spread. By hour 8, Nate had checked on him 3 times, and the presentation was consistent with a localized bacterial infection from the initial cut, not with the neurological cascade that preceded transition. By hour 12, Ryan was clearly stable, slightly confused about what was happening, and hungry. By hour 14, Nate said he was confident enough to allow him back into the main space. Ryan came out of the supply room looking pale and tired, and about 5 years older than he had going in. His mother held on to him for a long time. I sat in the operations room with Kyle and watched the surface camera feeds and tried to figure out why my hands were shaking. Week 3 and 4 were when the silo started functioning the way I'd imagined it could. Carla's grow room, with additional hands to tend it, and Holly's help with nutrition planning, doubled its output. She'd been waiting for more people to help with the labor-intensive parts, and now she had them. Ryan, once he was recovered and looking for purpose, became her primary assistant. He turned out to be genuinely interested in the plants, not in a forced way, but in the way that certain people find that growing things is a kind of anchor in a time when everything else is uncertain. The growing room had sweet potatoes, leafy greens, radishes, several varieties of herbs, and a small bean trellis that was still establishing. It wasn't producing enough calories to replace our stores, not yet, but it was supplementing them in ways that mattered for both nutrition and morale. Fresh food in an underground space does something to the air and the light that I can't fully quantify. It smells like something other than concrete and recycled oxygen. People gravitated toward the growing room for breaks in a way they didn't gravitate toward anywhere else. Tom's communications work was expanding. He'd been in contact with 3 other survivor groups by week 3, all of them within a 40-mile radius, all of them in various states of stability. The group he was talking to most regularly was a family of 5 on a farm property, about 16 miles away. A man named Gary Lester, his wife, his sister, and his 2 adult sons. Gary was former military, competent, resourceful, and had a diesel generator running on biodiesel that he'd made himself from soybean oil, which Carla immediately wanted to talk to him about. The farm had a small herd of cattle that had survived because Gary had managed to keep the infected away from the property perimeter, using a combination of fence reinforcement and a noise diversion technique he'd figured out on his own. The other 2 groups were more precarious. One was a bar in a nearby small town, a solid brick building that the owner had sealed when the outbreak hit, with about a dozen people inside. The bar had food, a full kitchen, and a substantial backup pantry. It also had alcohol, which meant that by week 2, the social dynamics inside were reportedly getting complicated. The owner, a woman named Terry, was managing by force of personality, but she was exhausted, and she'd told Tom that she needed resupply, and she needed it soon. The third group was harder to categorize. Tom had picked them up on an unusual frequency, not a standard emergency or ham band, but a frequency I recognized from my research as associated with certain prepper communities. The person transmitting called himself the Shepherd. He was talking about a settlement he called the Fold, about 25 miles from our location, in a direction I hadn't scouted yet. He described a community of 40-plus people who had come together, were organized and self-sustaining, and were inviting fellow survivors to join. That all sounded reasonable, until you listened to more of what the Shepherd was saying. He talked about the outbreak as a cleansing. He talked about the survivors as chosen. He talked about protocols for joining the fold that involved a period of observation and assessment, which he described as making sure people were right, which was a phrase he used several times without ever defining what right meant. I flagged this for the group but didn't rule it out. Sometimes the vocabulary people reach for in a crisis is strange without the situation itself being dangerous. We'd need more information before making any kind of judgment. I told Tom to keep monitoring. Derek and I did a second surface mission at the end of week 3. This time we went to a farm supply store and a grocery distribution warehouse that Kyle had identified from pre-outbreak satellite imagery. We took a different vehicle, a heavier pickup with a bed extender, and we spent 5 hours, round trip, collecting diesel fuel, medical supplies, seeds, tools, and 400 pounds of various canned and dry goods from the warehouse loading dock, which had been left unlocked and largely undisturbed. The infected in the area between us and the warehouse had changed since week 1. That was the thing I noticed on the second mission and didn't fully understand yet. There were fewer of them in the open fields, not because they were dying in large numbers, though some were, but because they were clustering, concentrating in specific areas. Anywhere that had been a center of human activity before the outbreak. Towns, crossroads, places with persistent sound sources like running generators or open water. The infected were dense, but in between those areas, in the farm fields and the empty roads, there was sometimes almost nothing. I thought at first this was random. By week 4, after Kyle analyzed 3 weeks of drone footage, I understood it wasn't. They were aggregating around sound. Persistent, ongoing sound. A generator running in an empty building would have 100 infected around it within a week. A creek making noise over rocks would have a cluster standing at its bank, reacting to the water sound. Wind chimes someone had left on a porch were surrounded by a dense press of bodies that never dispersed, because the sound never stopped. This was important for 2 reasons. The first was obvious. We needed to be careful about any sound source coming from our property. We were already careful, but this made it a different level of priority. Kyle did a thorough audit of every potential noise emission from the silo, the solar inverters, the ventilation exhaust, the generator exhaust port, and we muffled what we could and redirected the rest. The second reason was tactical. If you understood the clustering pattern, you could use it. Sound sources could be placed deliberately to draw infected toward or away from specific areas. It was a tool, not a perfect one, not reliable enough to bet your life on in the moment, but useful for planning. The thing at the grain elevator happened on day 31. Kyle had been doing routine drone overflights of the nearby area when he picked up something unusual at the grain elevator I mentioned earlier, the one where Derek had his close call on the second mission. There had been a persistent cluster of infected around it since week 1, which we'd attributed to some sound source inside. On day 31's footage, Kyle noticed that the cluster was bigger, significantly bigger, and that it had a specific shape, not the random milling we'd come to recognize. This cluster was oriented, all facing the same direction, toward the south side of the elevator structure. He flagged me. We watched the feed together. Every few minutes, the whole cluster would shift, not randomly, but as if responding to something. A slow turning, a reorientation, then settling. And in the center of the cluster, barely visible through the bodies around it, something that Kyle spent about 20 minutes trying to resolve with image processing before he finally said, "I think there's something in the middle." Something, not someone. Something different about the one at the center of the cluster. We couldn't get a clean image. The other infected around it were too dense, and the drone's angle wasn't optimal. Kyle spent 2 hours trying to get a better view without flying the drone low enough to attract their attention with its motor sound. What we eventually got, on the 3rd attempt with the best stabilization Kyle could manage, was an image that we both stared at for a long time without speaking. At the center of the cluster was a single infected, and it was not doing what the others were doing. It wasn't milling. It wasn't reacting to the sound source the way the others were. It was standing still, with its head turned away from whatever sound was coming from the elevator, in a direction that had no obvious stimulus. It was facing southeast. Southeast, roughly, was where we were. I told myself there were 50 explanations for an infected standing in a different direction from the others. I told myself I was pattern matching on insufficient data. I told myself it was coincidence. I also told Kyle to not fly the drone toward the elevator cluster for a while, and to prioritize mapping that area from a higher altitude. And I moved the discussion of the elevator cluster to the front of the next planning session agenda. Nate, when I described it to him, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There's something I've been meaning to bring up." He told me about the bite victims he'd seen come through the ER before the outbreak, in the months before everything collapsed. Not the obvious ones. The ones brought in during the early chaos. The ones before that. 3 patients, over a 2-month period, who'd presented with unusual bite wounds. Not human, not any animal he could identify with certainty, but the wound pattern was strange. The skin around the bites had that same specific discoloration we'd seen on Ryan's hand, but in these 3 cases, it was clearer. Deliberate pattern, not just infection. He'd flagged it in a report. Nothing had come of the report. I sat with that information for a while. Then I said, "Are you saying you think some of them are different?" He said, "I'm saying I don't know yet, and I don't like not knowing." Neither did I. Week 5 was when we started losing the careful rhythm we'd built. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small things that I should have been managing more actively, and wasn't, because I was spending too much of my attention on the external situation and not enough on the 14 people in the tube. The first sign was Greg. His panic episodes had become more frequent, and he'd been sleeping badly, and by week 5 he'd stopped leaving the room he shared with 3 others except for meals and bathroom. Not defiant, not aggressive, just retreating. I checked in with him. He said he was fine. He said underground was hard for him. I said I understood, and I made sure Nate was checking on him, and I moved on to the next problem. The next problem was between Kyle and one of Janet's people, a man named Aaron, who was in his mid-40s and had been a warehouse foreman before. Aaron was capable and willing to work, but he had strong opinions about how things should be organized, and he and Kyle had a territorial disagreement about the operations room that turned into a 3-day Cold War conducted entirely through pointed silences. I addressed that directly, which I should have done earlier. I pulled them both in, told them specifically what I was seeing, told them specifically what I needed from each of them, and established a clear division of responsibility. Kyle ran the monitoring and drone operations. Aaron ran the physical logistics and storage organization. Neither of them needed to be in the other's space. The third thing was harder. Holly came to me on day 37 and said she needed to talk privately. We went to the far end of the communications tunnel, and she told me that Pam had been keeping a private food supply. Not much. A modest amount of granola bars and dried fruit, gathered over the preceding 2 weeks, stored in a bag under her bunk. Holly had found it accidentally when reaching for her own things. She hadn't confronted Pam. She'd come to me. I sat with that for a day. I understood why Pam was doing it. Fear, distrust of the system, the primal need to have something that was hers, in a situation where almost nothing was. I understood it. It didn't make it acceptable, because the rationing system only worked if everyone trusted it, and it only maintained trust if it was genuinely universal. I talked to Pam alone. I didn't accuse. I said, "I know you have a private supply, and I need to understand why, so I can understand whether I'm failing somewhere in how I'm managing this." She started to deny it, then stopped. She looked at the wall. She said, "I've never trusted group systems. I always make sure I have something of my own." I said, "I get it. I do. Can I ask you to trust this one?" Long pause. She said, "What do you want me to do with what I've got?" I said, "Bring it to the common area and put it with the other supplies, and we're done discussing it." She did, the next morning. And Pam, who had been the most difficult person in the group for 3 weeks, became, after that conversation, one of the most consistently reliable people we had. She organized the secondary supply room with a precision and thoroughness that nobody else had managed. She made a detailed inventory that we still use. She made sure everyone signed the supply checkout log every time they took anything. People are strange. Fear looks like a lot of different things from the outside. Day 41. This is when the first major complication arrived from outside, and it came in the form of a message from Gary Lester. Gary had been expanding his monitoring of the surrounding area from his farm, and he'd made contact with another survivor group that we hadn't known about, a group of about 20 people who had established themselves in a large church building about 12 miles from Gary's farm and about 26 miles from us. He gave us their frequency. We made contact. The man who spoke for this group was not what I'd have chosen for the representative voice of a new community. His name was Frank Maddox, and in a different life he'd been a county sheriff's deputy. He was organized, decisive, and had the specific quality of a man who had decided early on that the rules of the old world didn't apply anymore, while simultaneously constructing a very specific new set of rules that benefited him personally. Frank's church group had food, fuel, and a number of firearms. They also had, Frank told us without embarrassment, a policy of armed border control. He meant that people who tried to reach their location without prior clearance were met by armed guards, and that the clearance process was at Frank's discretion. He'd heard about our silo through Gary, and he'd reached out because he had a proposal. He wanted to formalize a relationship, resources for resources. We had technical capability he wanted, the drone surveillance, the communications network, Carla's agricultural knowledge. He had physical security and personnel. He suggested a meeting. I said I was interested in meeting, and that I'd propose a time and location. After I ended the call, Tom said from across the room, "I don't like that one." I said, "Noted. What don't you like specifically?" He said, "He told us about the armed border control before he told us about his people. Their names, their needs, any of that. He wanted us to know he had guns before he wanted us to know he had people." Tom was right. I noted it and filed it for the meeting. The meeting was 10 days away. A lot happened in those 10 days. Day 43. Carla found something in the grow room that stopped me cold when she showed it. She'd found mold. Not on the plants. The plants were fine. On the wall of the grow room, behind a shelf unit that she'd moved to replant a section. The mold was extensive. A large circular patch, black-green, spreading over about 2 square feet of concrete. The kind of growth that takes months to establish, not weeks. She said, "This was here when we moved in." "This is old." I said, "Yeah. The silo's been empty for years." She said, "Owen, this isn't building mold." She showed me a magnified photo she'd taken on her phone. The mold had a structure I didn't recognize. Not the typical fanning pattern. This was arranged in concentric rings, almost regular, like it had been placed. The color at the center was a very dark brown-black, and the outer rings graduated through green-gray to almost white at the edges. I said, "What is it?" She said, "I don't know, but I think something was growing here, something intentional, and I don't think it was the data center people." We'd done some research on the silo's history before buying it. There had been 3 private owners after decommissioning in 1966. The third was the failed data center company. The second had owned it for 11 years in the 80s and 90s, and, as far as the public record showed, had done nothing with it. The first private owner, who'd bought it directly from the government in 1970, had held it for 13 years. His name, according to the deed records I'd looked at before purchase, was Harlan Coates. I had never looked into Harlan Coates specifically. I hadn't needed to. The structural history of the site was clear, and the ownership chain was clean from a property law standpoint. But standing in the grow room looking at that mold growth, I found myself thinking about Harlan Coates for the first time. Kyle found a brief mention of him in a local newspaper archive the following day, pulled up on the laptop from a cached version he'd pre-downloaded. Small Town Paper, 1983. A notice of probate for a man named Harlan Coates, who had died without known family, on his property in western Kansas. Age unknown. The estate, including an underground property, was to be administered by the state. Died on his property, meaning in the silo. I asked Kyle, was there any indication of cause of death? He searched for another hour. He found a death certificate filing reference in a county records index. Under cause of death it said, undetermined. I spent too much time thinking about Harlan Coates and not enough time thinking about the surface, and that imbalance nearly cost me. Day 47. Kyle picked up on the camera feeds what he initially thought was a loose cluster of infected moving along the county road toward our property. He flagged it, we watched, and I prepared to implement the noise control protocol we'd practiced, shutting down any surface sound source, going to minimal operations. Then Kyle said, "Wait." He zoomed the feed. The people moving along the county road weren't infected. They were moving with purpose, in a file, carrying equipment. 7 of them. One was carrying something that looked like a rifle. They were heading toward our access road. I said, "Get on the radio to Gary. Ask him if he knows who these people are." Gary came back within minutes. He didn't know them, hadn't seen them before. They'd come from the southeast, the same direction the elevator infected had been facing. I'm not saying those two things are connected. I'm just noting that I noticed it. Derek and I went to the surface. We took 2 of the handguns and left the rifles with Nate, who stayed at the blast door. We went out the secondary access point, a smaller hatch on the northwest side of the property, away from the main access road, and circled around through the brush to get eyes on the group from the fence line. 7 people. They looked rough, weeks on the road, inadequate gear, a couple of them with improvised bandage wrapping visible on arms and legs. Not infected, just very, very tired. One of them, a woman at the front of the group, saw me before I came out from the brush fully and went very still. She had short hair and a compound bow on her back, and her hands went up immediately, which was the right thing to do, and which told me she'd been thinking about what to do if she met armed survivors. I came out with my hands visible, one holding the handgun so she could see it, but not aimed at her. I said, "What are you looking for?" She said, "The place underground. Someone on the radio said there was a place." I said, "Who said that?" She said, "Gary." I looked at her, looked at the 6 behind her. One of them, a boy of maybe 10, was leaning against a fence post with the specific slack posture of someone who's been walking for hours past the point they had left to give. I said, "What happened to your group?" She said, "We had more. We don't anymore." I looked back at Derek. He was watching the tree line, which was the right instinct, not watching the people. I said, "Follow me." Their names were Dana, the woman with the bow, her younger brother Scott, a married couple called Pete and Lori Briggs, a man called Jay who nobody seemed to know from before and who had simply attached himself to the group several weeks ago, and a teenage girl named Emma who, like Ryan, had adapted to catastrophe with a practicality that made you feel both proud and sad. And the boy was Lori's son, whose name was Tyler, and who fell asleep before we reached the surface access point and had to be carried down the ladder by Pete. That brought our total to 21. The social dynamics of the space changed again, and this time I had less control over it because everyone was adjusting at once. The 14 who'd been established had their rhythms. The 7 new arrivals had their trauma and their different habits and their different references. The tunnel was noisier. The bathroom scheduling, which sounds trivial until you're 14 people sharing limited bathroom infrastructure and then becomes the single most reliable indicator of social friction, required complete restructuring. Dana was a problem in the best possible way. She was organized, competent, had an instinct for conflict de-escalation, and within 3 days had positioned herself as a kind of informal interpreter between the established group and the new arrivals. She did this without being asked, and without making it a power play, which is a specific skill that not many people have. By the end of her first week, she was part of the daily planning sessions as a matter of practical necessity. Jay was a different kind of problem. He worked. He didn't complain. He was physically capable, and he followed directions. But he didn't talk about his past, didn't respond to questions about where he'd come from or who he'd been before, and had a quality of watchfulness that was different from the general wariness everyone had developed. Kyle noticed it before I did. He mentioned it one evening while we were reviewing the camera feeds. He said, "The new guy watches the door. Every room he's in, he finds the door first." I watched Jay for 2 days after that. Kyle was right. It wasn't paranoid movement. It wasn't nervous or reactive. It was calm and deliberate and completely consistent. Every room, find the door. I pulled him aside on the 3rd day and said, "Military?" He looked at me for a moment, said, "Not exactly." I said, "Law enforcement?" He said, "Does it matter?" I said, "Not for most purposes, but I like to know who's in my house." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was a federal agent, Homeland Security, border operations. I don't want that known in the group. People get weird about it." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because of what I know about where this came from. I was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm not ready to talk about that yet." I said, "When you are, my door's open." He nodded and went back to whatever he'd been doing. I added Jay to the short list of things I was carrying around without having anywhere to put them yet. Day 54. The meeting with Frank Maddox. We chose a location that was equidistant from both our groups. A crossroads with a single grain elevator, which meant cover and elevation, but also the specific risk of a place that had been populated before. Kyle's drone sweep the morning of the meeting showed 7 infected in the general area, all of them static, none of them at the crossroads itself. Good enough. I took Derek and Nate. Frank Maddox brought 3 people, one of whom stood at the far edge of the crossroads with a rifle in a way that was meant to be a statement. I didn't react to the statement directly. Frank was exactly what Tom's instinct had told us he'd be. About 50. Thick through the shoulders. The specific kind of confident that comes from never having been seriously questioned in a professional context. He shook my hand with more force than needed and called me friend twice in the first 5 minutes. He had a natural fluency in the language of negotiation that suggested he'd been comfortable taking things from people long before the world ended. He wanted the drone network. Not access to the drone network itself. He wanted us to fly his perimeter, provide him with daily feeds, use our technology to extend his reach. In exchange, he offered what he called protection, meaning his armed people would extend their patrol range to cover the area between his location and ours. I said, "I'm interested in mutual support, and I'd like to understand more about what your community looks like before we discuss specifics." He said, "We've got good people, organized, disciplined. We keep the borders clean." Nate, who was standing to my right, didn't say anything, but I saw his jaw shift slightly. I said, "Clean in what sense?" Frank said, "We've had to make hard calls. People show up sick. We can't take chances. People don't fit the community. We find a better place for them." I said, "A better place." He said, "We send them on their way. We're not running a charity." I looked at him for a long moment. Thought about what Janet's group looked like when we'd found them. Thought about Tyler asleep against the fence post. Thought about what being sent on your way meant in a world with no destination. I said, "I need to consult with my team before agreeing to anything. I'll be in touch by radio within the week." He extended his hand again, same pressure as before. He said, "Don't wait too long, friend. Things are moving out here." On the drive back, we were using the truck. The route was clean. Derek said, "He's building something that'll come for us eventually." Nate said, "Yes." I said, "I know." Nobody said anything after that for a while. The radio contact with the Shepherd's group had been going on for 2 weeks in parallel with everything else, and Tom had been diligently noting everything he heard. I spent an evening reading through his logs, and what I found was more alarming the more of it I read. The Fold, that was what they called themselves, was not just a survivor community. It had its theology, which is maybe too strong a word, but the Shepherd had developed a framework for understanding the outbreak that he'd been preaching to his group. The basic premise was that the outbreak was the natural result of corrupted society, and that the survivors were literally the people who deserved to be there. The uninfected were the correct, the worthy. The infected were what happened to the corrupt. It sounds almost reasonable on its surface. It wasn't, because once you've decided that the infected are fundamentally deserved of their fate, the next question is how you decide who was always going to end up that way. And the Shepherd had answers to that question that Tom had been diligently, neutrally transcribing over 2 weeks of eavesdropping. One of the transmissions Tom had caught was a community meeting of some kind. Audio only, the Shepherd's voice, with a crowd in the background. He was talking about assessment, about how new arrivals to the fold underwent a period of evaluation, during which their character and worthiness were judged, and that those found lacking were released. Not turned away, released. The word was specific, and it wasn't clear whether anyone in the fold had a problem with what it meant. I asked Tom, "Have you identified the location of their transmitter?" He said, "Approximately. It's consistent with a property I can map, about 26 miles, southeast." Southeast. I didn't say anything about the elevator. Not yet. I asked Kyle to add the fold's approximate location to his mapping priority list for the fixed-wing drones. Day 60. The silo had been sealed for 2 months. It was a different space from the one we'd closed the door on in October. Not physically. The tunnels were the same tunnels. The concrete was the same concrete. But in the way that a space changes when people live in it long enough. There were personal photographs pinned above bunks. There was a board in the central tunnel where people put notes for each other. Practical things, reminders about schedule, but also, over time, other things. A small drawing that Tyler had made of the grow room that Carla had pinned up, and that everyone unconsciously looked at when they passed. A note from Ryan to Carla that said the sweet potatoes are bigger than my head now. I checked, followed by a drawing of a surprised cartoon face. Carla showed me the note one evening. She laughed, which was the best thing I'd heard underground. Real laughter, not the tense kind you produce when you're managing your own anxiety. I was making rounds, which was a habit I'd developed. A slow walk through the full tunnel system every evening before the 2100 session, checking systems, checking people, just being present in the space. And I stopped in the communications room where Tom was at his station. He had his headphones on. He looked up when I came in, pulled one ear off. He said, "I picked up something tonight, on the military frequency I've been monitoring." I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "I thought it was the automated loop at first, but it's different." He played me a segment he'd recorded. It was a man's voice, calm and measured, reading what sounded like a status report, grid coordinates, supply inventory figures, a transmission schedule, and then, "This is Whitehorse 6, signing off at 2300 hours. I said, "Military." Tom said, "Active military. That format is not automated. Someone wrote that today." I sat down in the chair next to him. We looked at each other. He said, "There's a facility out there somewhere, functioning, with structure." I said, "Or it's a recording of a functioning facility from 2 months ago." He said, "It's dated, today's date." I said, "Then someone is still organized." Tom said, "Should we respond?" I thought about it. A live military operation could be rescue and resources. It could also be commandeering, walking into a situation where we had no leverage and no control. I didn't know which it was. I said, "Let's listen for a week before we respond. Get as much information as we can from their transmissions before we show up on their radar." Tom nodded and put his headphones back on. The next 10 days were the most complex of the entire underground period, and I'm going to have to organize them carefully because multiple things were happening at the same time, and the connections between them matter. Thread 1. The military signal. Tom spent 4 days building a complete picture of the transmission patterns. Whitehorse 6 broadcast twice daily, morning and evening, on a military frequency that required specific equipment to receive clearly. The content was consistent with a functioning installation, not a moving unit, but a fixed location. Supply requests going out, status reports coming in, references to personnel by number but not by name. They were talking to other elements, receiving responses that Tom couldn't fully hear because they were lower power. Tom estimated, based on the transmission strength, that Whitehorse 6 was somewhere between 80 and 120 miles from our location. Thread 2. Jay. On day 63, Jay came to me after dinner. We went to the end of the eastern tunnel, away from everyone. He sat on a supply drum and looked at his hands for a minute. He said, "Before the outbreak, I was working a task force that was investigating unusual mortality patterns in bat populations in the western United States." I said, "Bat populations?" He said, "There's a disease pathway that starts in bats. Certain RNA mutations in that pathway." I said, "I've read about that." He looked up. I said, "Ankh Vosberg, preprint, 2016. That's what started all of this for me." He said, "Vosberg was part of the working group. Not officially, but she was connected to the people doing field research. The preprint she published was about a third of what she knew. The rest was in a report that was classified before she could release it." I said, "Classified by who?" He said, "Homeland Security, coordinating with CDC and a DoD unit." I saw the report. I pulled it from the archive about 6 months before the outbreak started, because the mortality patterns I was tracking in bat populations matched the intermediate host profile in her full research. I said, "Why was it classified?" He said, "Because the mutation pathway she'd fully described wasn't just natural. There were markers in it that were consistent with laboratory modification, not proof, consistent with. And there were 3 documented emergence sites in the United States in the 18 months before the outbreak that had been quietly contained and unreported." The tunnel was very quiet. I said, "Someone was working on this." He said, "I don't know if it was intentional release. It might have been containment failure, but I know it wasn't fully natural. And I know there were people who knew it was coming and chose not to warn the public." I said, "Where were those people when it happened?" He said, "I don't know. Some of them are dead. Some of them might be at a location like Whitehorse 6. The tunnel was even quieter after that." Thread 3. The Fold. Kyle got his drone footage of the approximate location of the Shepherd settlement on day 65. The settlement was in a large farm complex, a main house, several outbuildings, and a large barn. Kyle counted approximately 45 people by figure count from the aerial footage. The property had been fenced with what looked like a combination of existing agricultural fence and improvised additions. There were watch positions at the corners of the fence line. What caught Kyle's attention, and then mine, wasn't the settlement itself. It was what was to the east of the settlement, about 100 yards out. There were infected, 20, maybe 25 of them, in a contained pen. They'd been herded into a section of the fence line by what appeared to be some kind of funnel approach constructed from scavenged materials. The pen wasn't tight enough to prevent all movement, but the infected were circling inside it. Kyle said, "Why would you keep them?" I said, "I don't know yet." We watched the footage 3 times. On the 3rd pass, I noticed something that hadn't registered before. There was a figure walking the fence line of the pen, from the inside, walking between the infected and the containment barrier, not being harmed by them. The infected were reacting to the figure's movement, turning toward it, but not biting, not surging, just following with their heads. Kyle ran the footage forward, backward, enhanced what he could. The figure was a woman. She moved without urgency. The infected tracked her, but kept a consistent distance, not reaching, just orienting. I said, "That's not normal." Kyle said, "No." I said, "Get me better footage tomorrow." He said, "I'll try. I don't want to fly too low over that area." I said, "Careful is right, but I need to understand what that is." Thread 4. Frank Maddox. Frank had been patient for a week and a half after our meeting, and then he reached out on the radio with what he characterized as a limited-time proposal. He was going to be moving, he didn't say why, and he wanted to establish the relationship with us before he did. He had vehicles, he had fuel, he had people, and he had a specific something he didn't name, but suggested was valuable to us. He wanted to meet again, and this time he wanted a tour of our facility. I said, "That's not something I'm going to arrange." He said, "It's important to establish trust between communities." I said, "Agreed. The way we'll establish it is by demonstrating value to each other over time, at arm's length, until we've got good reason to do more." Pause on the radio. Then he said, "That's a shame. I had something I wanted to show you too. We found one of your people." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Older woman, mid-60s. She told us she'd come from near your direction. Said she was looking for someone named Tom. Said her husband had told her to find the silo." Every sound in the operations room stopped. Tom was across the room. He had heard. I watched his face. Frank said, "She's in good health. She's been with us for 3 weeks. She's a guest, not a prisoner. I want to be clear about that." I looked at Tom. Tom was gripping the edge of the table. I said, very carefully, "I'll need to speak with her." Frank said, "Of course. I'll put her on now." A pause. Static. And then a woman's voice, slightly rough, familiar to one person in that room, in a way that nothing else in the world was. She said, "Thomas, are you there?" Tom made a sound that I've never heard from a person before and never want to hear again. He crossed the room in 2 steps and was at the radio before anyone else moved. He said, "Donna, I'm here." She said, "Oh God, Thomas, I've been looking." The situation with Donna Gilmore and Frank Maddox was the thing that forced a decision I'd been putting off. Frank had her. She was fine. She was genuinely being treated as a guest. I confirmed this over 3 conversations with Donna directly, including specific questions designed to detect coercion that she wouldn't have recognized as such, but that would have produced different answers if she were being fed lines. She was frank. And Donna Gilmore was clearly a woman who had survived 6 weeks of catastrophe entirely on her own force of personality, and who was not going to be managed by anyone, including Frank Maddox. But she was there, and Tom, knowing she was alive and knowing she was in someone else's hands, was not a situation I could leave unresolved. I also had the information from Jay sitting in the back of my head, and the footage of the fold, and the White Horse 6 transmissions, and the cluster at the elevator, and the figure walking among the infected without being bitten. Everything was connected in a way that I couldn't see clearly yet, but the shape of the connection was becoming less vague. I called a full group meeting, not a planning session, a real meeting, all 21 people, in the central tunnel section, first one since the early days. I told them what I knew, not everything, not Jay's information, not the classified history, because that was still too fragmentary and too loaded to present without more context. But I told them about the White Horse 6 transmissions and my belief that there was an active military or government installation within driving range. I told them about the fold and what we'd seen in the drone footage. I told them about Frank and Donna. I told them about the clustering pattern that Kyle had been tracking and my growing sense that the infected were not fully random in their distribution. I said, "I think we've been in defensive mode, and it's been the right mode for the first 2 months. I think we're approaching the point where defensive alone isn't going to be enough. We need information. We need contacts that are trustworthy. We need to understand what's happening beyond our immediate range. And we need to do that before whoever or whatever is moving out there makes its moves first." I asked if anyone had thoughts they wanted to share. Dana said, "What's the plan for getting Donna back?" She put it exactly that directly. Not should we get her back, just what's the plan? I said, "I'm working on that." Jay said, "I want to come on the next surface mission." I looked at him. He looked back. I said, "All right." Nate said, "Medical kit for a longer range mission is different from what we've packed before. Give me 24 hours. Tom didn't say anything. He was looking at the table, but he nodded, once, slowly. Carla said, "Ryan and I need 2 more weeks of normal operations to get the growing room to the next output level. After that, I can cover a week of your absence without degrading anything." I said, 2 weeks then. Pam. I couldn't help it. I noticed this. Said nothing during the meeting. But afterward, she went directly to the supply room and started reorganizing a section that had gotten disorganized, with the focused energy of someone who needed to be useful and knew exactly how to be. 2 weeks. We used them well. Kyle did a full mapping of every surface route we might need, out to 50 miles in every direction, using all 3 drones on rotation. He built a map on the wall of the operations room, a physical map, not a screen, because screens can fail and maps on walls are always there, with color-coded overlays for infected density, known survivor locations, road conditions, and points of interest. He spent 1 full night labeling it with the specificity of someone who knew that every detail might matter. Derek and I did 2 supply runs in those 2 weeks, neither as far as we'd need to go for the Donna mission, but both productive. We found a functioning farm supply store 40 miles away that had been completely untouched. The owner had locked it and left, and the infected in the area had drifted away. We took everything useful: seeds, fertilizer, hand tools, a small tractor attachment that Carla had been asking about, replacement parts for the generator system that Derek had been watching nervously. We found a pharmacy in a small town that had its back door unlocked, and a supply of insulin that made Carla put her face in her hands in relief, and a range of other medications that Nate went through with the precision of a man making inventory of his own survival. Nate had been building a medical protocol for field operations, not just first aid, triage for the specific scenarios we were likely to encounter. He trained Dana and Jay and Holly in the protocol. He was calm and methodical about it, in the way that Nate was calm and methodical about everything, but I noticed him spending extra time on the session about bite wounds and the transition timeline, and I understood why. Jay, during those 2 weeks, told me more. He told me about the classified report in segments, over 3 evenings in the communications tunnel, after everyone else had gone to their bunks. What it amounted to was this. There had been a research program, DoD funded through a shell structure, studying the specific mutation pathway for purposes he couldn't confirm were defensive or offensive. 3 labs, 2 domestic, 1 offshore. The offshore lab was the one that Vosberg had been tangentially connected to. When the outbreak emerged from 4 simultaneous locations, Jay believed it was consistent with a catastrophic failure of the offshore lab, combined with samples that had been moved to the domestic locations for separate research. Not a deliberate release. A cascading accident involving multiple sites. He didn't know if anyone had survived who was part of that program. He said, but someone at Whitehorse 6 might know. The DoD footprint in those kinds of programs always has a continuity of operations element. Somewhere, someone put a copy of the research on a server behind a blast door. I said, you want to find it? He said, I want to know if there's anything in it that helps us understand what we're dealing with, because I've been thinking about the elevator. I said, the figure in the pen at the Folds location. He said, if some of them are different, if there's variation in the neurological cascade, then the rules we've been operating by might not be complete. I said, it might be the same mutation pathway, just expressed differently in certain individuals. He said, or it might be something else, something that happened after. After what? I didn't press him that night. I went to bed and lay awake for a long time, thinking about Harlan Coates dying alone in this tunnel, and what was in the walls of the grow room, and the figure walking unharmed among things that should have bitten her. Day 78. We left for the first real expedition. The team was me, Derek, Jay, Dana, and Nate. 5 people in 2 vehicles, the pickup truck and a second vehicle that Derek had prepared, a heavy-duty SUV that had been sitting on the surface since the beginning, fully fueled, and with a cargo modification that he'd done himself in the first 2 weeks. Extra fuel in sealed tanks in the cargo area, modifications to reduce noise emissions, a weapon mount that nobody had asked for, and that I didn't object to once I saw how cleanly he'd done it. The plan had 3 objectives. Primary, reach Frank Maddox's location, assess conditions, facilitate Donna Gilmore's departure from the group if she chose to leave, which I was confident she would. Secondary, survey the Fold location from close range before or after the Frank objective, depending on conditions. Tertiary, identify the direction of Whitehorse 6 if possible, establish any available intelligence about the installation. We left at 04:30, before dawn, which gave us the full day and the advantage of moving in low light on the outbound journey. The route Derek and Kyle had planned took us east and then north, skirting the town centers and following county roads and farm tracks. 43 miles to Frank's location, which was a church complex on the edge of a small farming community. Cleaner than I'd expected. The wide-open terrain of western Kansas meant you could see infected clusters from a long distance and plan around them, and the clusters were concentrated, not spread. We passed through 3 areas of high density, one of them requiring a 15-minute detour across a soybean field to go around a cluster of maybe 60 that had piled up against the chain link of a grain handling facility. Jay drove. He drove the way he'd watched doors, calm, purposeful, always reading 200 yards ahead. I didn't give him instructions, and he didn't need them. I want to describe the landscape as we drove through it, because it's something I keep coming back to. Western Kansas, in late fall, after 2.5 months of nobody maintaining anything. The crops that had been in the ground had been unharvested, and the combines that should have been running were sitting in fields at whatever point their operators had abandoned them. The corn stalks were brown and battered and standing at odd angles from wind. Here and there a field had burned, some electrical malfunction, a generator fire that spread, or just the dry wind and a heat source, and nobody to call the fire department. The burned areas were black and flat, and the ash had spread over everything nearby, so that in some sections the road was faintly gray, like a light snow that hadn't melted. The sky was enormous and entirely normal, clear, cold, with a few high clouds and a pale blue that had nothing to do with what was happening below it. I kept looking up at it when I could. It was the only thing that was completely the same as before. Frank Maddox's settlement was at a large church complex, a main church building that was brick and probably from the 1960s, a newer metal outbuilding that served as his vehicle and equipment storage, and a fellowship hall that was clearly the primary living space. The perimeter was chain-link reinforced with wooden posts, covering maybe 3 acres. There were 4 watch posts at the corners, occupied, and a vehicle, a heavy pickup with a light bar, doing slow patrol circuits. We announced ourselves on the radio before we came into visual range. Frank met us at the gate. He was bigger in person than I'd imagined from his radio voice. Not physically threatening in a conscious way, but large, and carrying the specific body language of a man who expected rooms to orient around him. He greeted me like we were old friends, which we weren't, and looked at Jay with an expression of brief calculation that Jay didn't appear to notice, but almost certainly did. He walked us in. The inside was organized, cleaner and more structured than I'd expected. Designated sleeping areas, a common dining space, a workshop area. He'd done a lot of what I'd done, just above ground, and with fewer resources and more people. His people moved with a purposefulness that told me discipline was being maintained actively. Some of them looked at us with open curiosity. Others didn't make eye contact at all. Donna Gilmore was in the fellowship hall, drinking coffee at a long table with 2 other women. She stood up when she saw us. Not rushed, not dramatic, just stood, with the solid certainty of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this, for approximately 6 weeks, and was now going to see it through in an orderly fashion. She walked over and put her hand on my arm and said, "Owen, good. I have things to tell Tom." I said, "He's going to want to hear everything." She said, "I know. Where's the vehicle?" She was ready to leave. She'd been ready since she'd figured out Frank was not the right situation for her, which I suspected had been fairly early on. Frank walked us back to the gate personally. At the gate, he stopped and said, with the exact tone of someone who has been patient and now isn't, "I want to revisit our conversation about the drone network." I said I'd like to, not today. He said, "I need more reach. Things are moving, and I need to see them moving." I said, "I understand. We'll talk." He said, "I've got something you'd want to know about. There's a military unit, about 90 miles east. Active. They've been broadcasting." I said, very carefully, managing my expression, "Interesting." He said, "I can give you their last known transmission coordinates in exchange for a month of drone coverage of my perimeter." I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us was being fully honest with the other at this point, and I think we both knew it. And there was a specific kind of professional respect in that mutual understanding that I found, under the circumstances, grimly funny. I said, "Give me 2 days to consult with my team." He said, "You've got 2 days." We drove out with Donna in the back seat of the SUV, not stopping, not looking back. Donna talked for 3 hours solid, which was about how long the drive was with the detours we took. She'd left home on day 2, when the situation in her town made staying impossible. She'd driven until the roads became impassable, abandoned the car, walked, found a group, lost the group in a bad night, found another group, arrived at Frank's settlement on day 18. She was even keeled about all of it, recounting it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has processed a significant thing by deciding that processing it is less useful than continuing to move. She said Frank was not a bad man in the conventional sense. He was not hurting people. He was making a community and running it in the specific way that his personality dictated, which was hierarchical and control-focused, and some of the outcomes of that approach were troubling. She'd seen 2 groups turned away from the perimeter, not harmed, turned away, which under current conditions was potentially a death sentence. She'd seen people within the settlement operating under what appeared to be a strong social pressure not to question the leadership. She said, "He's building something that works in the short term and cracks in the long term, but the short term might be quite long." I asked what she made of the fold, which I'd told her about briefly. She said, "I've heard talk of it. The word that came back through the community grapevine was that they were religious in a way that made people uncomfortable, and Frank was uncomfortable with them, which I found interesting." I said, "Interesting how?" She said, "Frank isn't the type to be easily threatened. If he was uncomfortable, the situation at the fold was unusual enough to register." We came back to the silo at 4 p.m. Tom was at the surface access hatch when we came up the access road. He was standing outside in the cold without a jacket. He'd been waiting, at the surface, in the October cold, without a jacket. I stopped the truck. Donna got out. Tom stood there. She walked to him, and he held on to her like a man who has been cold for 2 months. I looked away, gave them the space. The secondary and tertiary objectives of the expedition had to wait. That was fine. We'd accomplished the primary and gathered more information than I'd expected on the other fronts. What I did over the following 3 days, while the group absorbed Donna's return and the general status update, was process everything Jay had told me against everything we knew about Frank's information and Tom's White Horse 6 intercepts. The picture that emerged was something like this. Somewhere to the east, within 100 miles, there was a functioning military installation. They had communications, they had structure, and they may or may not have information about the origin and development of the outbreak. Getting to them could mean medical resources, intelligence, possibly coordination capability. It could also mean losing autonomy, walking into a situation where we had no leverage, and where our facility, our people, and our resources could become something that got commandeered rather than supported. To the southeast, the fold was doing something with infected that nobody else we'd encountered was doing, something that suggested some understanding, or some accidental discovery, about the infected that we didn't have. The woman who walked among them without being bitten was not explainable by anything in the framework I'd built my survival planning around. And Frank Maddox was accumulating resources and reach with the specific intention of eventually having enough of both that he didn't need to negotiate with anyone. We needed to move before any of these situations resolved without us. Day 85. The morning started with Kyle at the drone station at 0600, which was unusual. He typically ran his first sweep at 0730. He'd been woken up, he told me when I came in, by something in the camera feeds. He showed me. The elevator cluster, the one we'd been monitoring for weeks, the one with the individual in the center facing southeast, had moved. Not dispersed, not thinned, moved. As a group, overnight. They were now approximately a quarter-mile southeast of their previous position, on the county road, and they were moving. The peripheral milling had stopped. They were walking, in roughly the same direction, at the walking pace that infected maintained when they had a directional stimulus. They were heading toward us. I said, "How long?" Kyle looked at the feed, ran an estimate. He said, "At this pace, 4 to 5 hours." I said, "How many?" He said, 47 from the last count. I looked at the feed, 47. Moving with a kind of purposefulness that normal infected didn't have. The individual that had been in the center was not visible in the footage, either at the back of the group or obscured. I said, "Wake Derek." I thought fast about what 47 moving infected on our road meant practically. The silo was sealed. They could not get in. The blast doors would hold against anything short of heavy machinery. The surface installations, the solar array, the ventilation exhaust, the antenna for Tom's communications equipment, were more vulnerable, but the critical ones were recessed or low profile. The issue was the vehicles. We had 2 vehicles on the surface. If the infected cluster reached the property and surrounded the access road, we'd have a significant problem on the next occasion we needed to go out. I made a decision. I put Derek and Jay in the farm truck, and sent them out the northwest access point with a specific mission. Get to a farm track about 2 miles north, wait for the cluster to pass our access road, and then come back through. The idea was that the truck's engine noise would draw the cluster toward the sound, and then the truck would move faster than they could follow, drawing them north away from our property before we needed to use the access road. It worked. Mostly. Derek and Jay did exactly what I'd asked. The cluster heard the truck, turned toward it, began moving north. Derek drove slowly enough to stay ahead of them without losing them, led them about a mile north of our access road, then accelerated away and came back around. By the time they were back, the cluster was in an empty field, milling again, drawn north and now uncertain. The individual that had been at the center of the elevator cluster was visible in the drone footage as the cluster dispersed. It stood apart from the others at the outer edge of the milling group, and its head, Kyle zoomed in, enhanced, held his breath, its head turned back, toward the southeast, toward us. After a moment, it began walking back toward the elevator. None of the others followed. I watched that footage for a long time. I had to concede, to myself at least, that what I was watching did not fit anything in my framework. Not a thought process, not strategy, not communication, but some kind of residual orientation, some remnant that survived the neurological cascade, that was different from what the others had. I went to find Jay. I put the expedition to the Fold's location on the immediate priority list. Day 88, 3 of us this time, me, Jay, and Dana, who brought her compound bow on the grounds that it was quiet and she could use it, which were both accurate. The vehicles stayed back. This was closer range, and I wanted to approach on foot for the last half mile. The farm complex was bigger than it had looked in the drone footage. The main house was a substantial brick farmhouse, 2 stories. The barn was enormous, one of the old wooden multi-level type, the kind that doesn't get built anymore. The fence line was reinforced with salvaged materials, and the perimeter had clearly been expanded since the first footage Kyle had taken, pushing out into what had been a grass pasture on the west side. The pen where the infected had been was still there, on the east side. But there were more of them now, 60, 70. Dana put her hand on my arm and pointed. The woman was there again, inside the perimeter of the pen, walking slowly, with her arms slightly away from her sides. The infected around her were tracking her movement, but not rushing her. She moved, and they moved. She stopped, and they stilled. It was, and I'm choosing this word carefully, coordinated. Not intelligent, but coordinated in the way that a flock of birds moves. A group response to a signal that none of them individually understands, but that all of them receive. She was the signal. Jay said, very quietly beside me. Immune. I said, immune how? He said, if the neurological cascade uses a receptor that some people don't express, or express differently, then they could be bitten and not convert. And if the virus is still present in their system without causing damage, the infected might recognize the molecular signature and not respond aggressively. I said, a carrier. He said, or a variant, or something that happened after conversion that we don't have a framework for yet. I need to get close enough to talk to her. I said, that's not happening today. He said, I know, but soon. She turned. I don't know if she heard us. We were 70 yards away, upwind, behind a brush line. We'd been absolutely still and quiet for 20 minutes, but she turned and looked in our direction, and her head tilted with the specific quality of someone who knows something is there without knowing what. I said, not moving, let's go, slow. We went. She didn't call out or signal anyone. When Dana looked back, she was watching us. When we were far enough, Dana said, that was not okay. I said, no. Jay said nothing. Back at the silo, I spent the evening writing everything down. Not just for this record. For the planning session the next morning, I needed to lay out what we knew and what we didn't know, and what we needed to find out. And I needed to do it in a way that didn't create panic, but also didn't downplay the genuine strangeness of the situation. What we knew. 1. There was an active military installation within approximately 90 to 100 miles. They had communications and structure. Frank Maddox knew about them, and had used that knowledge as a bargaining chip, which meant they might be making contact with survivor communities in the region. 2. The Fold was experimenting with, or discovering something about the infected that nobody else was. A person in their community had a relationship with infected that was biologically unusual. Whether the shepherd understood what he had, or was using it for something specific, we didn't know. 3. The infected cluster at the elevator had demonstrated directional behavior that deviated from normal patterns. One individual in that cluster had shown something like a persistent orientation. These two facts were related. Whether they were related to the Fold's discovery was unconfirmed but strongly suggested. 4. Jay believed the outbreak had a human origin. Laboratory modification. Accidental release. This changed the framework for thinking about whether anything like a cure or a reversal was theoretically possible. It also changed the framework for thinking about who might have relevant information. What we needed: contact with Whitehorse 6. Not just passive monitoring. More information about the woman at the Fold, who she was, what the shepherd knew or thought about her, and whether she was being held or staying voluntarily. Enough distance from Frank Maddox to prevent him from becoming a direct problem while keeping the channel open. A longer-term plan that wasn't just surviving. We'd been surviving for almost 3 months. Surviving was necessary, but it was going to stop being sufficient, and I had 21 people in a tube who were going to need more than indefinite underground existence to stay functional as human beings. The planning session ran for 4 hours. Tom opened the Whitehorse 6 question by playing a recording of one of the recent transmissions. After it finished, he said, "They've changed their encryption pattern this week. That means they've added personnel, or they've detected that someone is monitoring them without authorization. We need to make contact before they go dark." Kyle said, "If they go to a frequency hopping protocol, we'll lose them entirely." I said, "Tom, can you transmit something on their frequency that establishes we're not a threat and invites contact?" He said, "I can. I need to know what to say." I said, "Say that we're a civilian installation with medical, agricultural, and communications capability, that we have 21 people, and that we have information about the outbreak's origin that may be relevant to them, and say we're requesting direct contact." Tom wrote it down, looked at it, said, "That last part is going to get their attention." I said, "I know." Jay said, "They might also come to us rather than respond on radio. We should be prepared for that possibility." Derek said, "Prepared how?" Jay said, "They'll likely send a reconnaissance element first. We should assume they'll find the surface installation before they make contact. How visible are we from the air?" Kyle pulled up his surface camera feeds. We spent 30 minutes talking about what a military aerial reconnaissance would see, and whether that was a problem. Decision: we'd transmit Tom's message twice a day for 5 days. If we got a response, we'd take it from there. If we got visitors instead of a response, we'd greet them calmly and see what they wanted. The Fold question was harder. Dana said, "The woman in the pen, is she there voluntarily?" I said, "I don't know." Dana said, "If she's not, that changes the picture." I said, "It does." She said, "So we need to find out." Nate said, "If she's immune and the shepherd understands that, he'd want to keep her close. She's probably the most valuable person in his community." Holly said, "Or the most dangerous one, if the infected follow her." That thought sat in the room for a moment. Tom said, "Could it be used? The thing she can do?" I said, "I've been thinking about that. Not as a weapon, as a tool. If she can lead infected away from an area, that changes what we can do on surface missions significantly." Jay said, "It also changes the threat calculus for large hordes. You could redirect them." Carla said, very quietly from the corner where she'd been sitting, "Or we could just leave her alone and see if she's okay." Everyone looked at her. She said, "I'm not saying don't investigate. I'm saying let's not plan to use someone before we know anything about them, including whether they want to be used." That was the right thing to say. I said so. Decision on the Fold. Establish contact with the woman directly if possible, without involving the shepherd initially. Low-risk approach. Information gathering only. We got a response from Whitehorse 6 on the third day. Not on the radio, on the surface. Kyle's camera feeds at 0900 showed a vehicle, military, a gel TV from the profile, on the county road about 2 miles out, stopped. Not moving, just stopped, with what looked like a camera or sensor array deployed on the roof. They were looking at us. I said, "Tom, transmit the message again right now." Tom transmitted. We all waited. 3 minutes later, on the frequency Tom had been using for outgoing transmissions, a voice came back. Not the formal Whitehorse 6 pattern from the evening broadcasts. A person's voice, direct, slightly uncertain. "This is Captain Rick Ewald, National Guard, 137th Infantry. Are you the installation at the GPS coordinates I'm reading on screen?" Tom said, "Affirmative." A pause. Then, "You mentioned having information about the outbreak's origin. Can you confirm?" Tom looked at me. I nodded. He said, "We can confirm. We also have 21 civilians, an agricultural operation, medical capability, and a communications network covering a 40-mile radius. We'd like to discuss terms of contact." Another pause. Ewald said, "Terms." Tom said, "We're an independent civilian installation. We're interested in cooperation, not absorption. We want to understand each other's situation before we discuss anything further." Long pause, then, "I'd like to meet, face to face. I'll come alone and unarmed. Can you accommodate that?" I took the handset from Tom. I said, "Captain Ewald, this is Owen Hartwell. I built this facility. Come at your convenience. We'll meet you on the surface." Captain Rick Ewald was 34 years old, originally from Wichita, an engineer officer who had transitioned into the National Guard after 6 years of active service, and who had been at Whitehorse 6, a repurposed emergency management facility in an old civil defense installation, since day 8 of the outbreak. He drove out alone in the gel TV, as promised. He came up the access road with his hands visible through the window, got out, stood in the cold without a weapon visible. I met him on the surface with Derek and Jay, which may have been a mistake, because Jay recognized him. Not personally, professionally. He clocked the specific posture, something about the phrasing in the first exchange, the way Ewald processed the situation, and afterward told me quietly that he thought Ewald had a DoD intelligence background that predated the Guard service. I filed that information. Ewald was direct in the way that competent military officers are direct, not theatrical, just efficient. He said, "Your installation is better than ours, in 2 significant ways: power redundancy and food production. We have you on communications, and we have you on firepower." I said, "What do you want from us?" He said, "Information first. You said you had something on the outbreak's origin. That's the only thing I want before anything else." I said, "We have a partial picture. It's enough to have significant implications for what kind of help might be possible. Before I share it, I want to understand what your installation is doing with the information you have." He said, "We're trying to connect the surviving communities in the region into a functional network. We have contact with 7 groups. You're the most capable civilian installation I've found." I said, "What does connection look like in practice?" He said, "Shared intelligence, shared resources, coordinated response to specific threats, not chain of command. We're not trying to commandeer anyone. We don't have the authority or the capacity. We're trying to build something functional out of what's left." I looked at Derek. Derek gave me the small nod that meant he didn't see an obvious lie. I said, "Come inside." Ewald spent 4 hours in the silo. He met everyone. He walked the tunnel system. He sat in on a meal. Carla had made a bean and rice dish with fresh herbs from the growing room that smelled incredible. And Ewald looked at the food, and then at the grow room, and then at me, with an expression I couldn't fully read. He ate with us. He talked. He asked questions that were informed without being leading. He was good at information collection in a way that confirmed Jay's assessment of his background. And at the end, in the operations room with just him and me and Jay, Jay told him about the classified report. Ewald sat very still when Jay described it. He said, "Are you Homeland?" Jay said, Was. Ewald said, "There are people at my installation who know about that program. Not many. 2 of them are scientists. One of them specifically worked on the containment response to the 3rd domestic emergence site that you mentioned." Jay said, "What do they know?" Ewald said, "They know the mutation pathway. They know the molecular profile. And one of them, this is something I've been sitting on for 2 months and not sure what to do with. One of them thinks there's a subset of the population with a receptor variant that the virus can't use for neurological cascade." I said, "Immune." He said, "Theoretically. We haven't confirmed it in a live case." I looked at Jay. Jay looked at me. Neither of us said anything about the woman at the fold for a moment. Then I said, "We've seen a live case." What followed was 3 days of the most intensive information exchange I've ever been part of. Ewald went back to Whitehorse 6 and came back the following day with one of the scientists, a woman named Dr. Anita Paulos, 40s, intense, the kind of researcher who talks in full paragraphs with citations. She and Jay spent 2 hours in the communications tunnel, and then she came to me with a legal pad covered in notes and said, "Approximately, what you've described seeing at the fold location is consistent with our model of receptor variant immunity. The woman in the pen almost certainly cannot be infected through the standard bite pathway. Her presence doesn't trigger the aggressive response in infected individuals because the viral signature she presents is," she used a phrase I'll approximately render as, "different enough to be recognized without being threatening." I said, "And the figure at the elevator who was facing southeast?" She looked at the notes again, said, "The infected have been showing something we've been calling residual orientation. The neurological cascade strips most of the cortex, but it's not perfectly complete in all individuals. A small percentage retain fragmented associations. Not memories, not recognition, but some persistent directional drive. We don't know what creates the orientation. It's the thing that worries me most." She said it calmly, the way scientists deliver things that worry them most. I said, "Why most?" She said, "Because it suggests the virus is doing something other than just expressing the standard cascade. There's variation in the outcome. And variation in a pathogen is the thing you watch." Jay said, "Mutation." She said, "Or selection, or something else. I don't have enough data yet. That's why I need to talk to someone who's been observing large populations of infected systematically." Kyle spent the next day with her, going through every hour of drone footage he'd accumulated over 3 months. They sat at the operations console, and she made notes and asked questions, and he answered them, and by the end of the day, she had a document that she said was the most detailed behavioral data set she'd encountered. In exchange, she gave us 3 things. Antiviral medication that reduced the severity of any secondary infection from bite wounds that didn't result in conversion, not a cure, but a meaningful improvement in survival odds for close calls. A diagnostic protocol for identifying receptor variant individuals, which involved a specific blood test that Holly, with guidance from Paulos, could perform with equipment we had in the medical bay, and a clearer picture of what Whitehorse 6 was doing and what it had. What it had, among other things, was a functioning vehicle workshop, a small armory, a medical lab, and 8 scientists who had been working for 3 months on every aspect of the outbreak that their equipment and samples could illuminate. What it needed, among other things, was the kind of longitudinal surface observation that Kyle's drone network could provide. The outline of a partnership was clear. The details were less clear and would take time to work out. But the structure was there. The fold situation resolved itself in a way I hadn't anticipated. Day 93. Tom picked up a transmission from an unusual source. Not the Shepherd, not the standard fold broadcast, but a separate transmitter, weaker, that seemed to be coming from somewhere close to, but not at, the fold's compound. Low power, as if someone was trying to be heard without being heard by the wrong people. The voice was a woman's. She gave her name once, Mira Solis. She said she was a member of the fold and she needed to speak with someone outside. Tom recorded it and woke me. We established contact the following night. Mira transmitted again at the same time, same frequency. Tom was ready. She spoke quickly and quietly. She said she'd been at the fold for 6 weeks. She said the shepherd, whose actual name was Douglas Kemper, a former real estate developer from Nebraska, had been using the knowledge of her ability and had been planning to use her more directly as what she described as a demonstration of divine protection. He intended to have her walk among a large group of infected publicly to confirm to his community that the fold was indeed chosen, and to draw new members through the display. She said, "I don't want to be a demonstration. I don't know what I am yet. I don't want to be told what I am by Douglas Kemper." Tom said, "Do you want to leave?" Long pause. She said, "I can't leave without help. He has people watching, and the infected in the pen. They'll follow me if I move them, but I can't control where they go. If I leave and they follow me, someone could get hurt." Tom said, "We may have people who can help with that. Can you give us 2 days?" She said, "I can give you 2 days." I spent those 2 days on the phone with Ewald and planning with Derek and Jay. The plan that emerged was not simple, and I didn't love all of it, but it was the plan that worked with what we had. Day 95, the fold extraction. Ewald sent 2 of his people to support. They were military police, both experienced, both equipped, and both clear that this was a civilian-led operation which they were supporting and not commanding. That clarity had taken about 45 minutes of conversation to establish, and was worth every minute. 8 people on the operation. Me, Derek, Jay, Dana, Nate, the 2 military police from Ewald's unit. Their names were Sergeant Mike Doran and Specialist Kelly Fitch, and a 9th person who came late to the plan, Gary Lester from the farm property, who had driven himself to our silo on day 94 when he heard through the radio network what we were planning, and who said he knew the fold's property area well because he'd farmed adjacent land for 12 years. Gary was 60, stocky, unimpressed by most things. His contribution was knowing which drainage ditch on the south side of the property had a culvert large enough to crawl through, and emerged inside the fence perimeter. The plan. Gary and Jay through the culvert to reach Mira and get her out the same way. Derek and Dana in the truck at the south road as extraction. Nate and I at the front gate as distraction. Not confrontation, distraction. Doran and Fitch at the perimeter to handle any pursuit if it came to that. Douglas Kemper was the variable I was least sure about. He might respond to Mira's departure with alarm and a security response. He might respond with the specific violence of a man who has built his authority around one person and is watching that person leave. I didn't know which. I went to the front gate of the fold at 7 a.m. Not armed visibly, though I was armed. Gary had confirmed the fence guard schedule from what Mira had told him, and the morning shift at the front had 1 person, which was standard. I knocked, which was a funny thing to do at a chain-link gate, but it was what there was. The guard was a young man, maybe 20, who looked at me through the fence with the specific expression of someone who has been given a set of rules and is checking my appearance against them. He asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to talk to Douglas Kemper. I said I was the person who ran the silo installation to the northwest, and that we were interested in a community partnership. The young man went to get someone. While he was gone, I was doing the calculation in my head about how much time Gary and Jay needed, and whether I was buying enough. The someone he came back with was not Kemper. It was a woman who was apparently his second in command, who was calm and sharp, and who asked me, through the fence, what specifically I was proposing. I proposed 20 minutes of conversation, face to face. She let me in. Kemper was in the farmhouse. Big man, mid-50s, well-groomed in the specific way that certain men maintain, regardless of external circumstances, because the grooming is about something other than hygiene. He shook my hand with assessment behind his eyes and invited me to sit. I spent 20 minutes talking with him. I'll give him credit. He was intelligent, and he was not the unhinged zealot I'd half expected. He was a man who had found an explanation that worked for him and was building community around it. And the explanation was wrong, but the community-building instinct wasn't. Under different circumstances, with a different framework, he might have been someone worth working with. The 20 minutes was exactly enough. Jay transmitted on the short-range radio that Dana monitored. Clear. I stood up, thanked Kemper for his time, said I'd be in touch. He said, as I was leaving, "Where is Mira?" I stopped. Didn't turn. Said, "I don't know who that is." He said, "I think you do." I turned. He was looking at me with a flat calm that was worse than anger. He said, "She's not something you can take and use. She doesn't understand what she is yet. We were taking care of her." I said, "She'll be fine." He said, "You'll need her eventually. Things are changing out there in ways you haven't tracked yet. When you need her, come back and we can talk." I left without responding. The extraction completed cleanly. Mira was in the truck, small and quiet, with Gary's enormous hand on her shoulder. She had a cut on her forearm from the culvert edge, and she was wearing a coat that wasn't hers. Jay was next to her, looking at the middle distance. Derek drove. I sat in the passenger seat. Nobody talked for the first 20 minutes. Then Mira said, from the back seat, "Where are we going?" I said, "A place underground. 70 feet of concrete. You'll be safe." She said, "I've been safe. That's not the same as free." I said, "No, it's not. You can leave whenever you want." Long pause. She said, "Okay." What came next was the longest stretch of the whole period, and in some ways, the least dramatic, and in some ways, the most significant. Mira Solis was 29 years old. She'd been a biology graduate student before the outbreak, which was almost too convenient and yet completely real. She had the specific intellectual vocabulary and the specific frustrated intelligence of someone who had been in the middle of training to understand things that were currently happening to her. Her immunity was confirmed by Paulos's blood test within 24 hours of her arrival. Not just receptor variant. She had a particular combination of markers that Paulos said, with the controlled excitement of a scientist presenting a significant finding, was consistent with a person who had been exposed to an earlier, attenuated form of the virus, months before the outbreak. Her body had built a partial immune response that then prevented full cascade. "When did you get sick?" Paulos asked her. Mira thought about it. "August," she said. "I got a fever for about a week. I thought it was just flu." Paulos wrote something on her pad. Showed it to Jay. Jay's face did something complicated. He looked at me and said, "Third domestic emergence site, August of last year. The one I mentioned. The one that was quietly contained and unreported." Mira had been in that area. Not contained. Exposed and recovered. And then the full version of the pathogen had hit, and she had been the only person in a 20-mile radius who didn't convert. She'd walked out of the building she'd been in on day 3 of the outbreak, surrounded by infected that didn't touch her, and she hadn't stopped walking for 2 weeks until she found the fold. I sat with that for a while. She said, "What does it mean?" Paulos said, "It means your immune response might be replicable. If we can identify the specific antibodies and understand the early exposure pathway, we might be able to produce something that provides partial protection." Mira said, "A vaccine?" Paulos said, "Potentially. This is a long way from a vaccine, but it's a start." Mira looked at the concrete wall of the tunnel. She said, "Okay, what do you need from me?" Paulos said, "Blood samples, to begin with, and your memory of the August illness, in as much detail as you can provide." Mira said, "How long does this take?" Paulos said, "Honestly, years, under normal circumstances." Mira said, "And under current circumstances?" A pause. Then Paulos said, "I don't know, but I've never had a starting point this clear before." The following weeks were the period of building. Not the physical building I'd done in the years before the outbreak, though there was some of that too. We expanded the tunnel system's lateral storage using hand tools and a lot of work. We improved the grow room's output capacity. Derek upgraded the generator redundancy. What I mean by building was the network. Ewald formalized the partnership with Whitehorse 6, and the terms were what I'd asked for. Mutual support, not command. We gave them the drone surveillance and the communications network. They gave us medical support and their scientific capability, and a direct line to whatever broader government structure was still functioning, which turned out to be less than I'd hoped, but more than nothing. There were 3 other installations in the region, with some form of continuing government function. None of them were large. All of them were overwhelmed, but they existed. Through the network Tom had been building, which now extended to 14 distinct survivor communities of various sizes, we started doing something that I'd been thinking about since day 40 and hadn't had the capacity to attempt. We started moving people. Not randomly, purposefully. Communities that had complementary needs and resources were connected. The bar that Terry ran had food and social space, but no medical capability. We connected her with a group of retired nurses who were in a farmhouse 12 miles away, and who had medical knowledge but a storage problem. Gary Lester's cattle and biodiesel production were connected, through Carla's agricultural network, with 3 farming operations that were running on their reserves. It sounds administrative when I describe it. It didn't feel administrative. Every connection we made involved a surface mission or a long radio negotiation, involved physical risk, involved making judgment calls about who to trust and how far. We got some of those calls wrong. There was a small community of about 30 people that we connected with the resource network, only to discover, 2 weeks later, that their leadership was extracting a tribute from some of their members in exchange for safety, not violence, but coercion. We helped the coerced members leave, which caused a significant confrontation that Dana and Doran handled with less bloodshed than it could have involved, but more than I wanted. There was a moment, about 3 weeks after the network started functioning, when I was sitting in the operations room at about 11 at night, and Kyle was mapping the active connections on the wall chart, and Tom was in the communications room running the evening sweep, and the map had 14 pins in it, connected by drawn lines, and next to some of the pins were small notes in different handwriting. Donna Gilmore's careful print, Kyle's quick scrawl, Dana's left-hand slant. I sat and looked at it for a while, at the map of the connections we'd made. 14 communities, approximately 300 people total, connected by radio, by intermittent road contact, by the shared protocols we'd worked out for supply exchange and emergency response. It wasn't civilization. It was the beginning of the idea of civilization. Frank Maddox came to us on day 109. Not invited, not announced. He drove up the access road in the middle of the afternoon with 2 vehicles, his heavy pickup and one of his security patrol trucks, and 6 people. He stopped at the gate, which we now kept chained when not in active use, and waited. Kyle had seen him coming on the camera feeds 4 minutes before he arrived at the gate. I had time to get everyone calm and get the right people to the right positions before I went up. I came out of the surface hatch and walked to the gate. Frank said, "I need to talk." I said, "So talk." He said, "Things have changed. The fold is gone." I said, "What do you mean, gone?" He said, "Kemper's people left. 3 days ago, the whole community, 70 people, loaded up and moved out. Nobody in the area knows where they went, and there's something moving in from the southeast that I don't have the firepower to handle." I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "A large group, not infected, survivors, armed. They've been moving through the region for 2 weeks, taking settlements. 3 communities have disappeared." I said, "Disappeared how?" He said, "I don't know. Nobody answers on the radio anymore. And 2 of them had strong signals and active populations 3 weeks ago." I looked at him through the gate, at the 6 people with him who looked, underneath the surface competence Frank cultivated in his people, scared, the specific scared of people who've been safe and are now not sure anymore. I said, "Come in." I opened the gate. Frank walked through it and stopped inside, looking at the surface installation, taking in the solar array and the antenna posts and the ventilation exhaust. He did the engineer's involuntary assessment of a built environment. I watched him understand what this was. He said, "You really did it." I said, "I did. Come down." The 3 days following Frank's arrival were some of the most complex of the entire period. Frank in the silo was a social event of a specific kind. He was not dangerous, but he took up a lot of room in the way that people with his particular personality do. Rooms reoriented toward him, conversations bent to accommodate him, and the equilibrium we'd built over 3 months was perceptible to him, and he perceptibly adjusted to it. He was not stupid. He understood that he was in my house on my terms, and he was intelligent enough to not push against that directly. But there was a night, about 36 hours in, when I heard him talking with Jay in the communications tunnel. I wasn't eavesdropping. The tunnel system carries sound in unpredictable ways, and I was in the operations room with a thin wall between us. What I heard was Frank describing the moving group in the southeast, with enough specific detail that I understood he knew more than he'd told me. The group had leadership. They were organized. They were taking resources and leaving behind, in each location they'd passed through, a population of compliant survivors who were now operating under the moving group's rules. I went around and into the communications tunnel and said, "What are we not discussing?" Frank looked at me. Jay looked at me. Frank said, "The group has a name. They call themselves New Order. They've got about 150 people, military training in the leadership, and a specific doctrine about how survivor communities should be organized." I said, "Which is what?" He said, "Contribution and protection. You contribute your resources, they provide protection. Non-negotiation." I said, "That's not what I'd call a doctrine. I'd call it a shakedown." He said, "Call it what you want. They're coming this direction." I said, "How long?" He said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I sat down in the tunnel corridor, cross-legged on cold concrete at 11 at night, thinking about 150 organized people with military leadership coming our direction. I said, "Why didn't you tell me this when you first came?" He said, "Because I needed to know what you were going to do before I told you what I knew. I needed to know if you were going to be useful." I looked at him. He looked back. There was something honest in it, finally. Not comfortable, but honest. I said, "We're useful." He said, "Yeah, that's what I thought." The next week was about preparation. We had things New Order didn't know about. The drone surveillance network, the communications grid covering 4 dozen miles, and Mira. Mira's ability, which Paulos had been studying and documenting, was not a weapon, and I was not going to use it as one. That was a line I'd drawn at the beginning, and I wasn't moving it. But Mira had been thinking, on her own, without being asked, about what she could do, and she'd come to me one afternoon with a specific idea. She said, "The infected follow me. Not all of them, the ones close enough to perceive my presence. When I move away from a location, the ones nearby tend to come with me for a while before losing me." I said, "Yes." Kyle's footage confirmed that. She said, "There's a large cluster in the fields between here and the direction New Order is coming from. About 45 miles out, 300 infected by Kyle's count. New Order is going to have to go around them or through them." I said, "Okay." She said, "I could move them. Not permanently. The effect fades after a mile or so, and they'll recluster. But I could move them to a position that complicates New Order's route." I said, "Walk me through what that means for you physically." She said, "I'd go to the cluster, get close enough for them to perceive me, walk south for a mile, drawing as many as I can, then exit the cluster and leave them in a position that blocks the road New Order most likely needs." I said, "With an extraction team?" She said, "Yes, your people." I said, "You know this is voluntary. I'm not asking you to do this." She looked at me with the patience of a 29-year-old who is used to being given disclaimers she didn't request. She said, "I know. I'm volunteering. The operation was the most carefully planned thing we'd done since the start. Derek built a specialized extraction route. Jay ran the security. Nate was medical on standby. Doran and Fitch from Ewald's unit came because they knew their business, and I wanted the best I had on this." Mira walked into a cluster of 300 infected on a Wednesday morning in January, with snow on the ground and her breath making clouds in the cold air, and she walked them south for 9/10 of a mile before the connection faded and she signaled us. She came out of the cluster at the south edge, stepping backward, and the infected milled at the boundary for a moment and then stopped following. They'd moved, though. They were now blocking the intersection that Kyle's analysis had identified as New Order's most likely approach route. Mira came back to the truck shaking slightly. Not from fear, I thought, but from something else, some specific effort of being near them, of maintaining that strange proximity without recoiling. She sat in the back seat and didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. Then she said, "It's not like walking among normal people. They're not people, exactly, when you're that close. But they're also not nothing." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "They feel something when I'm near them. Not recognition, not warmth. Something like," she looked for the word, "relief. Very faint. Like something is slightly less wrong for a moment." The tunnel was quiet. She said, "I don't know what to do with that." I said, "Neither do I." We drove back in silence. New Order's approach changed when their advanced scouts hit the infected cluster. Kyle's drones tracked the situation for 2 days. The cluster had settled into its new position and was not moving. New Order stopped, assessed, tried to go around through a different route that added significant time, and put them through difficult terrain. They lost a vehicle to a roadway problem, bridge that couldn't handle the weight. They lost time. During that time, Tom's network was busy. Every community that New Order had previously absorbed, that was now operating under their doctrine, we made radio contact. Not to tell them to resist, because resistance without support is just getting people killed, but to tell them we existed, that there was a network, that when the time was right there was somewhere else. 2 communities responded. One of them gave us information about New Order's leadership structure and supply chain that was more useful than we'd expected. The person who transmitted it did so in a 15-minute window, while the leaders were otherwise occupied, and then went back to normal. They were taking a significant risk, and they knew it. I thought about Harlan Coates, alone in this tunnel, in 1970. No network, no plan that anyone else was part of. Just a man, and a closed door, and whatever he thought was coming. I thought about the mold on the grow room wall, still growing there, behind where Carla had put up a clean sheet of plastic to seal it off. We'd never identified what it was. Paulos had taken a sample, and it was in her lab at Whitehorse 6. She hadn't come back with an answer. Some things take a long time. New Order arrived at the outer edge of our network on day 123. Not at our location. They were still 30 miles away, but they were close enough that the communities on our outer rim could see their vehicles. I made a decision. I asked Ewald to be part of the conversation. He came to the silo with 2 of his officers. We sat in the central tunnel, all of us. My people, Frank's people, who were now settled in the silo's expanded space, the military contingent, and we talked about what we were going to do. Frank said, "We can fight." Ewald said, "Fighting 150 organized people costs more than it gains in any scenario I can model." Dana said, "So we negotiate." I said, "We negotiate from a position of strength, which means they need to understand clearly what they'd be dealing with." Jay said, "They need to know they'd be dealing with a network, not a single location." I said, "Yes, and they need to understand that absorbing this location is not a transaction. It's a commitment to a conflict that doesn't end here." Tom said, from the communications room doorway, "They're on the radio. They're requesting contact." The contact was with a man who called himself Colonel Thorne, not his actual rank, almost certainly. Ewald ran the name and designation later, and found nothing in the remaining military records we had access to. A self-appointed title. But he sounded like someone who had held actual command and was used to the specific dynamic of one party having leverage. He told me, in his first transmission, that we were in a position to join a larger structure that would provide protection and resource stability. I said, "We already have those things." He said, "You have a facility. We have scale." I said, "Describe your governance structure." Brief pause. He said, "We have clear lines of authority and responsibility. Resources are pooled and distributed according to contribution." I said, "Who determines the contribution levels?" He said, "Leadership, based on assessment of each community's capacity." I said, "And what recourse do members have if they disagree with leadership's assessment?" Longer pause. He said, "We're building something in a difficult environment. Consensus isn't always practical." I said, "I appreciate that. Here's what I'd like to propose. We have a network of communities covering a 40-mile radius. We have communications infrastructure, agricultural production, medical capability, and a relationship with functioning government elements. We're interested in expansion, not absorption. If your people want to join a network based on mutual contribution with transparent governance, we can discuss that. If your model requires us to surrender autonomy to your command structure, we're going to have a long conversation that ends with you having a different picture of the obstacle. Silence on the radio. He said, "What kind of obstacle?" I said, "The kind that includes 300 infected, relocated to your most likely approach routes, and a drone network that has been tracking your movement for 2 weeks." More silence. He said, "You're threatening me." I said, "I'm describing the situation accurately. There's no threat in it. The infected aren't under my control. I'm just noting that we've been observing you." He said, "I'll call back." He did. 3 hours later, he asked for a face-to-face. The meeting with Thorne was the most carefully choreographed thing we'd done. Ewald came, 2 of his military police, Frank and 2 of his people, Dana, Jay, me. Thorne was indeed ex-military. He had the bearing, the diction, the specific economy of motion that genuine training produces. He also had, in person, something that hadn't come through on the radio: uncertainty. Not about the situation, about the decision he was standing at the edge of. He'd built something he believed in. 150 people, fed, organized, moving through the broken landscape with a structure that worked. He believed it was right. He believed the directive model, clear command, pooled resources, assigned roles, was the correct answer to the specific problem of rebuilding in a world without institutions. He wasn't wrong about the model having advantages. He was wrong about it being the only model. I showed him the map, the wall map, which Kyle had brought a photocopy of. 14 pins, 300 people. The grain lines of the network: this community has cattle, this one has medical, this one has fuel, this one has communications, this one has the only agronomist in a 100-mile radius who knows how to get growing systems to produce food in a basement. I said, "What I'm offering is this. Your people join the network as a community, with the same terms as everyone else. You provide what you have. You receive what you need. Your leadership makes decisions for your community, and the network leadership, which is collective, not individual, makes decisions for the network. You get a vote. You don't get veto power, and neither do I." He looked at the map for a long time. He said, "What's the governance structure?" I said, "We're building it. You'd be part of building it. That's a genuine offer." He looked at Ewald. Ewald looked back without expression. He looked at me. Said, "What do you need from me to make this work?" I said, "Your weapons inventory and your experienced personnel, integrated with the network's defense function under a shared command structure that includes at least 2 other community leaders, and transparency about what you took from the communities you absorbed and where it is." That last one was the hard one. He'd taken things. Some of them from communities that were still part of our network. Some of them from communities that no longer existed as independent operations. He sat with it. Then he said, "The communities I absorbed are still functioning. Nobody's being harmed." I said, "They'll be given a choice. Stay or join the network independently. That's not negotiable." Another long pause. He said, "All right." It didn't go smoothly after that. Nothing that happens in the real world goes smoothly after an agreement, because the agreement is the easy part, and the implementation is everything else. 2 of the communities Thorne had absorbed chose to separate and join the network on independent terms, which created a week of tense radio negotiation. One chose to stay under his structure, which I respected because they chose it. 3 of Thorne's senior people had a problem with the arrangement that manifested as passive non-cooperation, which Thorne had to address internally. I stayed out of it. The weapons integration was a 6-day process that Derek oversaw, and that required Doran and Fitch, and 2 of Thorne's most experienced people in the same room for long periods, which produced friction, and also, eventually, a genuinely functional combined security protocol. Frank Maddox, in the arrangement, became the network's logistics coordinator for the Southwest sector, a role that used exactly his organizational skills and that kept him too busy to be building his own power structure. He didn't entirely like it. He also didn't leave, which told me what I needed to know about whether this was working. Day 147. Paulos called us on the radio from Whitehorse 6 and said she had results. Not the vaccine. That was still months away, maybe more. But the mold sample from the grow room. I'd forgotten about the mold, or I'd let it slide to the back of the list. There were too many things on the list. Paulos said, "The mold in your sample is a biosynthetically modified organism, not naturally occurring. The structural markers are consistent with a lab modification in the early 1970s. I said, 1970. She said, more or less. The modification is fairly crude by modern standards. Someone was experimenting with producing specific secondary metabolites. I said, what kind of metabolites? She said, among others, a compound that the virus's surface proteins respond to as a neutralizing agent. Simplified, it produces something that the virus can't replicate in the presence of. The tunnel was very quiet. She said, whoever was in your facility in the 1970s was working on a way to neutralize a virus that, according to the official history, didn't exist yet. Harlan Coates died alone in this tunnel, cause of death undetermined, in 1983. I said, Harlan Coates. She said, I don't know that name. I said, I do. I sat in the tunnel for a long time. Whatever Harlan Coates had been doing down here for 13 years, with the mold growing in his walls and no known connection to any institution, he'd been working on something. Something that was relevant. Something that nobody had known about until Paulos looked at a sample of the growth he'd left behind in a concrete wall in western Kansas. I don't know who he was. I don't know where the mold came from originally, or how he knew to grow it. I don't know what he thought he was preparing for. I know that he prepared, and that he was alone in it, and that 40 years later his work was sitting in Paulos's lab as the basis of something that might matter enormously. Day 160. 28 communities now in the network, about 600 people, including Thorne's former group. The wall map had a second sheet added to accommodate the reach. Mira was living in the silo, helping Paulos remotely, running her own observations in the field under careful conditions that she managed herself. She'd developed protocols for her expeditions that were more sophisticated than anything we'd have designed for her, which is what happens when you trust someone to figure out their own capabilities. She was working on something she described as communication research. She believed there was more information in the interaction between herself and the infected than a simple avoidance response, and she was trying to find it. I asked her what she thought she might find. She said she didn't know, but that the word that kept coming to her, which she said she knew, was unscientific and probably wrong, was remnants. Like what she was perceiving in their response to her wasn't just biology. Like some trace of what they'd been was still in there somewhere, very faint, like a signal at the edge of what you could hear. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I didn't know enough to tell her she was wrong. Tom and Donna were, I think, the steadiest people in the tunnel. Tom's radio work was the connective tissue of everything we'd built. Every relationship, every supply run, every emergency call had his voice at some point. Donna organized the silo's social life, which is not a trivial job when you have 27 people living in a confined space. She made sure people talked to each other. She made sure the anniversaries and the difficult days didn't pass unnoticed. She started a record, handwritten, in a series of notebooks she'd asked Carla to request on a supply run, of every person in the network, where they were, what they did, what they'd been before. She called it a registry, not a memorial, a registry, a document of present people. Ryan, who was 15 now, and growing so fast that the jeans Gail had brought for him were too short within 8 weeks, had become Carla's full partner in the agricultural operation. They'd expanded beyond the silo's grow room to a surface greenhouse, enclosed, defensible, designed by Derek with reinforced plastic sheeting, and then to 2 test plots in cleared fields 3 miles from the property. The surface plots were the first honest agriculture that had happened in the area since the outbreak, and the first time I walked out to them and stood in a field where something was growing because someone had planted it, I felt something I didn't have a word for. Not hope, exactly. Not victory. Something more specific. Like the gap between what was lost and what might come back was measurable for the first time. Day 191. This is where things get complicated. I have to be precise about what I know and what I'm inferring, because some of this is still unresolved, and I want the record to be accurate. We'd been getting transmissions from 2 sectors of the network that described a change in infected behavior in their areas. Not the clustering we'd observed, but something different. Infected in 2 separate locations, about 30 miles apart, were doing something that had never been observed. Staying in the same position for extended periods. Not milling. Not reacting to sound. Staying. One community described it as infected standing in a field for 18 hours without moving. Not dead, they could see breathing. Not reacting to anything. Just still. We sent drones to both locations. The footage showed infected in a specific posture. Not collapsed. Not standing normally. Slightly crouched. With their heads turned slightly upward. Not all of them. A portion of the infected in each area. Maybe 20%. Paulos looked at the footage. Her face did something controlled. She said, "This is consistent with a stage of the neurological cascade that we modeled, but that I hoped we wouldn't see." I said, "What stage?" She said, "The virus is not static. It's been 3 months. In some individuals, the cascade has continued beyond the initial presentation." I said, "Continued how?" She said, "The cortical stripping that produces the initial behavioral profile isn't necessarily the end of the progression. In laboratory models, certain strains continued to modify neural architecture after the initial damage. What this looks like neurologically is," she paused, "I don't want to speculate. I need samples." I said, "What does it look like behaviorally?" She said, "We don't know yet." The still infected in both areas had been still for about 3 days when the communities started reporting it. On day 2 of the stillness, they'd begun to move, not toward sound, not randomly, in a specific direction. All of them, in each location, in the same direction, east. The something wrong that had been sitting at the edge of our picture for weeks sharpened into something specific. I convened an emergency meeting. Me, Ewald, Paulos, Jay, Frank, Dana, Nate, Mira. Paulos said what she'd found and what she suspected, in language that was careful and measured, and underneath which was a person doing everything in their power to not convey the specific level of alarm she was feeling. The short version, if the cascade progression was producing a second phase of neurological change in a portion of the infected population, we needed to understand what the second phase produced. The directional movement wasn't random. Something was pulling them east. She didn't know what. East was where the outbreak had been densest. East was where the major population centers had been. East was where, by all available information, the largest concentrations of infected still existed. Mira said, "I've felt something change in the ones I work with. The relief feeling I described, it's less. They're more agitated when I'm close." Nate said, "The receptor response might be changing." She said, "Or I'm changing. I don't know." Jay said, "There are 3 scenarios here, and we should name them." He laid them out. 1. The second phase progression is the virus's natural endpoint in certain individuals, a terminal neurological state that has no further behavioral implications. They're moving east because something attractor level is there, a large sound source, a persistent chemical signal, something we can identify if we investigate. 2. The virus has mutated in the 3 months since initial outbreak, and we're seeing the expression of a variant that has different behavioral properties. This requires immediate sample collection and analysis, and changes our entire threat model. 3. Something is causing the directional movement deliberately, not the infected's internal drive, but an external factor, something that can either draw them or direct them. Nobody said anything for a moment. I said, "We investigate all 3 simultaneously with the resources we have. Ewald, can you get Paulos to a location where she can collect samples safely?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Mira, I want you to continue your work, but I want Jay with you from now on. and I want daily check-ins. If you feel anything change in how they respond to you, we stop." She said, "Okay." Jay said, "I'll reach out to the contacts I have from before. If there are people from the original program who survived and went east, they might know about the progression." I looked at the map, the 28 pins, the lines between them, the 600 people in the network's custody, the new growth Carla was planning for spring, Paulos's lab with Harlan Coates' mold in it. I said, "Nobody panics. We don't have enough information to know what this means yet. We keep building, we keep gathering information, and we respond to what we know, not to what we're afraid of," Frank said. "And if what we know is bad," I said, "then we deal with the bad thing. That's what the last 6 months has been." He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded. Day 204. This is where this account is going to have to stop being retrospective and become something else, because I'm at the edge of what's resolved enough to record clearly. What I can say, Paulos has samples, she's working. The analysis will take time that we may or may not have enough of. The directed movement is real and continuing. Infected in the second phase progression are moving east, in numbers that are growing. The communities in the eastern sectors of the network are documenting it, and the documentation is consistent. Jay made contact with someone. A woman, on a frequency he recognized from his pre-outbreak work. She's east, she's alive, and she has information that Jay believes is the missing piece of the picture. Getting to her requires going farther than any of our expeditions so far, east, through terrain that is becoming more complicated every day. Mira asked me if she could come on that expedition. I said I'd think about it. The silo is full. 27 people in space that was designed for 6, and it doesn't feel crowded the way I thought it would. It feels like something that changed its nature over time, from a bunker to a home to a headquarters. The concrete doesn't smell like old rust anymore. It smells like coffee and soil, and the specific human smell of people who are alive and working together. There is a map on the operations room wall with 28 pins in it. Carla's growing room has 3 new varieties of vegetable that she's trying for the first time. Tom's voice is on the radio every night, reaching 40 miles in every direction, threading communities together with information and contact. Ryan drew another picture. This one shows the whole silo cross-section, labeled, with little cartoon faces next to each room, indicating who spends time there. It's not accurate to scale. It's completely accurate to everything else. I think about Harlan Coates sometimes, in the quiet. What he knew, and where he got it, and what he was doing down here for 13 years by himself. I'll probably never know the full answer, but I think he understood, in the way that certain people understand things before the rest of us catch up, that the right response to an impossible problem is to put 70 feet of concrete around your best effort and keep working. There's one more thing I want to record before this account reaches whatever it reaches. On day 198, I went to the surface alone in the early evening. Not for a mission, just to stand outside, something I'd started doing occasionally when the tunnel felt like it was pressing in from all sides and I needed 10 minutes of sky. I stood on the surface in the cold. The solar panels were dark. The ventilation exhaust was a faint murmur behind me. The fields were white. Snow had come in, second snow of the season, and the sky was the specific dark blue that happens just before full dark, with one star visible low in the west. I'd spent, I calculated it, about 7 years building this place, and 6 months living in it, and the better part of a decade before that, being the kind of person other people thought was unhinged for believing something bad was coming. I didn't feel vindicated. I want to be clear about that. I felt the specific weight of a man who built the right thing for the wrong reasons, and right reasons both at once, and whose building turned out to matter in ways that had nothing to do with what he originally imagined, and who is standing in a winter field with 27 people, 60 feet below him, waiting to see what comes next. The star got brighter as the sky got darker. I stood there until I couldn't feel my hands. Then I went back down. There was coffee on. Donna had made it. The tunnel was warm. Everyone was still there. End of account. Owen Hartwell. Day 204. Prepared for the Network Record Archive. Central Installation. Western Kansas. Addendum. By Tom Gilmore, Communications Lead. Owen doesn't like ending on something personal. He thinks records should be functional. But I've been on the radio every night for 6 months, and I know the difference between a frequency that's carrying information and one that's carrying something else. This document is carrying something else, underneath all the practical detail. It's carrying the fact that one man spent $1 million and 7 years of his life preparing for something he desperately hoped wouldn't happen. And when it happened, he opened his door. That's the part that should be in the record. Everyone else who came down the ladder made a choice to trust him. I don't think any of us regret it. The star he was looking at, by the way, was Venus. I know, because I went up 20 minutes after he came down, and it was still there. I went up, I looked at it, and then I went back to my station. White Horse 6 was calling.